Chapter 1, The Lord Bellarion. On a day of September, the year of our Lord 1409, a dust-laden horseman clattered into the courtyard of a palace near the bridge of the Trinity in Florence, and announced himself a courier with letters for the noble Lord Bellarion. He was consigned by a man-at-arms to an usher, by the usher to a chamberlain, and by the chamberlain to a slim young secretary. From this you will gather that access to the Lord Bellarion was no longer a rough-and-ready business, and from this again, they had traveled far since detaching himself from the Lord Ficino a year ago. At the head of the Condado which he had raised, he had fought in the course of that year a half-score of engagements, now in this service, now in that, and in all but one he had won easy triumphs. Even his single failure, which was at Veruno in the pay of Iestas of Ferrara, was such as to enhance his reputation. Forced by overwhelming numbers to admit defeat, yet by sheer skill he had baffled the great Pandolfo's attempt to surround him, and had brought off his Condado with such little loss that Pandolfo's victory was a barren one. His Condado, now known as the Company of the White Dog, from the device he had adopted, had grown to the number of 1,200 men, with a heavy preponderance of infantry, his handling of which was giving the other great captains of Italy food for thought. In fame he was a rival of Piccinino, almost a rival of Sforza himself, under whose banner he had served in the war against his old opponent Buonterzo. And Fra Serafino de Imola tells us unequivocally in his chronicle that the ambush in which Buonterzo ended his turbulent life in March of that year was of Bellarion's planning. Since then he had continued in the service of the Florentine Republic at a monthly stipend which had gradually been raised with the growth of his Condado to 20,000 gold florins. Like all famous men, he was not without detractors. He was charged with a cold ruthlessness, which brought, it was claimed, an added horror into warfare, shocking adversaries, as it had shocked Buonterzo on the Trebia, into ordering that no quarter should be given. So opposed, indeed, was his ruthlessness to the accepted canons of Italian warfare, that it was said Bellarion could enlist only Swiss mercenaries who notoriously were not queasy in these matters. The probable truth, however, is that he employed only Swiss because they were the best infantry in the world, and further so as to achieve in his following a solidarity and cohesion not to be found in other companies, made up of a medley of nationalities. Lastly, he was found lacking in those spectacular qualities of leadership, in that personal knightly prowess by which such men as Carmignola took the eye. Never once had he led a charge, stimulating his followers by his own heroical example. Never had he taken part in an escalade, or even been seen at work in a melee. At Sabriso, where he had routed the revolted Pisans, it was said that he had never left the neighborhood of his tent and never mounted his horse until the engagement was all but over. Hence, whilst his extraordinary strategic talents were duly respected, it began to be put about that he was lacking in personal courage. Careless of criticism, he had pursued the course he prescribed himself, gathering laurels as he went. On those laurels he was momentarily resting in the City of the Lilies, when that courier rode into the courtyard of his palace with letters from the Count of Biendrate. The Lord Bellarion, as men now called this leader grown out of the erstwhile nameless waif, in a pleated full-sleeved tunic of purple satin gripped about his loins by a golden girdle, and with massive chain of gold about his neck, stood in a window embrasure to decipher crabbed, untidy characters, indited from Alessandria on the feast of St. Anthony. "My dear son," Ficino wrote, "I need you, so come to me at once with every man that you can bring. The Duke has called in the French. Boucicault is in Milan with 6,000 men, and has been appointed ducal governor. Unless I strike quickly before I am myself stricken, Milan will be made a fief of France, and the purblind Duke a vassal of the French king. It is the Duke's subjects themselves who summon me. The gout, from which I have been free for months, is troubling me again infernally. It always seizes me just when I most need my strength. Send me word by the bearer of these that you follow at speed." Bellarion lowered the letter and gazed out across the spacious, sunlit courtyard. There was a ghost of a smile on his bronze face, which had gained in strength and virility during the year that was sped. He was faintly, disdainfully amused at the plight into which John Maria's evil blundering must have placed him before he could take the desperate step of calling in the French. The Malatesta domination had not been long-lived. Their Guelphic grip had been ruthlessly crushing the city, where every office, even that of Podesta, was given into the hands of Guelphs. And that same grip had been crushing the Duke himself, who discovered belatedly that, In throwing off the yoke of Facino for that of the Malatesta, he had exchanged King Log for King Stork. Then, in his shifty, vacillating way, he sent ambassadors to beg Facino to return. But the ambassadors fell into hands of the Malatesta spies, and the Duke was constrained to shut himself up in the fortress of Porta Giovia to evade their fury. Whereupon the Malatesta had drawn off to Brescia, which they seized, Pandolfo loudly boasting that he would not rest until he was Duke of Milan, so that John Maria Visconti should pay the price of breaking faith with him. Terror now drove the Duke to lengths of viciousness and inhumanity unprecedented even in his own vile career. Issuing from the castle Porta Giovia to return to his palace, so soon as the immediate menace was removed, he found himself beset by crowds of his unfortunate people, distracted by the general paralysis of industry and menaced by famine. Piteously, they clamored about him. "Peace, Lord Duke! Peace! Give us Facino for our governor, and give us peace! Peace, Lord Duke! Peace!" His fair face grimly set, his bulging eyes glaring venomously, he had ridden ahead with his escort, closing his ears to their cries, and more than one unfortunate was trampled under the horses' hooves as they passed on. But the cries continuing, that evil boy suddenly reined in his bravely caparisoned charger. "You want peace, you dogs? You'll deafen me with hellcat cries of peace. What peace do you give me, you filthy rabble? But you shall have peace. Oh ho, you shall have it." He stood in his stirrups and swung round to his captain. "Ho, there you!" His face was inflamed with fury, a wicked mockery, and evil mirth hung about his swollen purple lips. So terrible, indeed, was his aspect that Delatory, who rode beside him, ventured to set upon his arm a restraining hand. But the Duke flung the hand off, snarling like a dog at his elderly mentor. He backed his horse until he was thigh to thigh with his captain. "Give them what they ask for," he commanded. "Clear me a way through this dung heap. Use your lances. Give them the peace they want." A great cry arose from those who stood nearest, held there by the press behind. "Lord Duke! Lord Duke!" they wailed. And he laughed at them, laughed aloud in maniacal mockery, in maniacal anticipation of the gratification of his unutterable bloodlust. "On, on," he commanded. "They are impatient for peace." But the captain of his guard, a gentleman of family, Bertino Mantegazza, sat his horse appalled, and issued no such order as he was bidden. "Lord Duke," he began, but got no further, for the Duke, catching the appealing note in his voice, seeing the horror in his eyes, suddenly crashed his iron glove into the young man's face. "God's blood, will you stay to argue when I command?" Mantegazza reeled under that cruel blow, and with blood suffusing his broken face would have fallen, but that one of his men caught and supported him in the saddle. The Duke laughed to see what he had done, and took command himself. Into them. "Charge!" he commanded in a shout on which his voice shrilled up and cracked. And the Bavarian mercenaries who composed the guard, to whom the Milanese were of no account, and all civilians contemptible, lowered their lances and charged as they were bidden. 200 of those poor wretches found in death the peace for which they clamored. The others fled in panic, and the Duke rode on to Broletto through streets which terror had emptied. That night he issued an edict forbidding under pain of death the utterance of the word peace in the city of Milan. Even from a mass must that accursed word be expunged. If they had not also clamored for Facino, it is probable that the Facino fresh ambassadors would have been sent to invite him to return. But the Duke would have men know that he was Duke, that he was not to be coerced by the wishes of his subjects, and so, out of perversity so blind that it took no account of pit he might be digging for himself, the Duke invited Boucicault to Milan. When Boucicault made haste to answer, then the appeal to Facino which should have gone from the Duke went, instead, from the Duke's despairing subjects. Hence Facino's present summons to Bellarion. There was no hesitation in Bellarion's mind, and fortunately no obstacle in his present employment. His agreement with the Florentine Republic had been determined in the last few days. Its renewal was at present under consideration. He went at once to take his leave of the Signory, and, for days ahead of his army, he was in Alessandria being affectionately embraced by Facino. He arrived at the very moment at which, in council with his captains and his ally the Marquis Theodore, who had come over from Vercelli, Facino was finally determining the course of action. "I planned in the sure belief that you would come, bringing at least 1,000 men. I bring 1,200, all of them well seasoned. Good lad, good lad. Facino patted his shoulder. Come you in, and let them hear from you. Leaning heavily upon Bellarion's arm, for the gout was troubling him, he led his adoptive son up that winding stone staircase which Bellarion so well remembered ascending on that morning when, as a muleteer, he went to fool Vignate. So, Master Theodore is here, said Bellarion, and glad to come. He's been restive in Vercelli, constantly plaguing me to place him in possession of Genoa, but I've held him off. I do not trust Master Theodore sufficiently to do all my part before he has done any of his. A sly fox that and an unscrupulous. And the young Marquis? Bellarion inquired. Facino laughed. You will not recognize him. He has grown so demure and staid. He thinks of entering holy orders. He'll yet come to be a man. Bellarion stared. That he was well your letters told me. But this, how did you accomplish it? By driving out his tutor and the others who came with him. A foul crew. He paused on the stairs. I took their measure at a glance, and I had your hint. When one night Fenestrella and the tutor made the boy drunk and themselves drunk with him, I sent them back to Theodore with a letter in which I invited him to deal with them as their abuse of trust deserved. I dismissed at the same time the physician and the body servants, and I informed Theodore that I would place about the Marquis in future none but persons whom I could trust. Perforce he must write to thank me. What else could he do? You laugh. Faith, it's laughable enough. I laughed, too, which didn't prevent me from being watchful. They resumed the ascent, and Bellarion expressed the hope that the Lady Beatrice was well. Common courtesy demanded that he should conquer his reluctance to name her to Facino. He was answered that she was at Casale, Facino having removed her thither lest Alessandria should come to be besieged. Thus they came to the chamber where the council sat. It was the same stone chamber with its vaulted ceiling and Gothic windows open to the sky, in which Vignate had given audience to Bellarion. But it was no longer as bare as when the austere tyrant of Lodi had inhabited it. The walls were hung with arras, and rich furnishings had been introduced by the more sybaritic Facino. About the long oaken table sat 5 men, 4 of whom now rose. The one who remained seated, as if in assertion of his rank, was the regent of Montferrat. To the newcomer's bow he returned a short nod. Ah, the Lord Bellarion. His tone was languid, and Facino fancied that he sneered. Wherefore he made haste to snap. And he brings 1,200 men to the enterprise, my lord. That should ensure him a welcome, the regent admitted, but without cordiality. He seemed, Bellarion observed, out of humor and disgruntled, shorn of his habitual suavity. The others came forward to greet Bellarion. First, the magnificent Carmagnola, taking the eye as ever by the splendor of his raiment, the dignity of his carriage, and the poise of his handsome fair head. He was more cordial than Bellarion had yet known him, but there was something of patronage, of tutorial commendation, in his congratulatory allusions to Bellarion's achievements in the field. He may yet be as great a soldier as yourself, Francesco, Facino growled, as he sagged into the chair at the table's head to ease his leg. Missing the irony, Carmagnola bowed. You'll make me vain, my lord. My God, said Facino. Came the brawny, bearded, red-faced Königshofen, grinning honest welcome and taking Bellarion's hand in a grip that almost hurt. Then followed the swarthy, mercurial little Piedmontese captain, Giasone Trotta, and lastly there was a slight, graceful, sober, self-contained boy in whom Bellarion might have failed to recognize the John Giacomo Paleologo of a year ago, but for the increased likeness he bore to the Princess Valeria. So strong was that likeness grown that Bellarion was conscious of a thrill as he met the solemn, searching gaze of those dark and rather wistful eyes. Place at the table was found for Bellarion, and he was informed of the situation, and of the resolve which had been all but reached. With his own 1,200, and with 3,000 men that Montferrat would send after leaving a sufficient force to garrison Vercelli, Facino could put 8,000 men into the field, which should be ample for the undertaking. They were well mounted and well equipped, the equipment including a dozen cannon of 300 pounds apiece and 10 bombards throwing balls of 200 pounds. And the plan of campaign? Bellarion asked. It was expounded to him. It was extremely simple. They were to march on Milan and reduce it. All was in readiness, as he would have seen for himself. For as he rode into Alessandria, he had come to the great encampment under the walls, where the army awaited the order to march. When Facino had done, Bellarion considered a moment before speaking. "There's an alternative," he said at last, "which you may not have considered. Boucicault is grasping more than he can hold. To occupy Milan, whose people are hostile to a French domination, he has drawn all his troops from Genoa, where he has made himself detested by his excessive rigors. You are confusing the issues here. You plan under persuasion that Milan is the enemy, whereas the only real adversary is Boucicault. To cover himself at one point, he is uncovered at another. Why aim your blow at his heart, which is protected by his shield, when you may aim it at his head, which is unguarded by so much as a helmet?" They made him no answer save with their eyes, which urged that he himself should answer the question he propounded. March, then, not on Milan, but on Genoa, which he has so foolishly left open to attack, a folly for which he may have to answer to his master, the King of France. The Genoese themselves will offer no resistance, and you may take possession of the city almost without a blow. Approval came warm and eagerly from the Marquis Theodore, to be cut short by Facino. Wait, he rasped. The notion of Theodore's ambitions being entirely gratified before Theodore should have carried out any of his own part of the bargain was not at all in accordance with Facino's views. "How shall the possession of Genoa bring us to Milan?" "It will bring Boucicault to Genoa," Bellarion answered. "It will draw him from his stronghold into the open, and his strength will be reduced by the fact that he must leave some force behind to keep the Milanese in subjection during his absence." So strategically sound did the plan appear to Facino upon consideration, that it overcame his reluctance to place the region of Montferrat at this stage in possession of Genoa. That reluctance he afterwards expressed to Bellarion, when they were alone. "You do it, not for Theodore, but for yourself," he was answered. "As for Theodore—" Bellarion smiled quietly. "You need not grudge him any advantages. They will prove very transient. Payday will come for him." Facino looked sharply at his adoptive son. "Why, boy," said he at last, in a voice of wonder, "what is there between you and Theodore of Montferrat?" "Only my knowledge that he's a scoundrel." "If you mean to make yourself the scourge of scoundrels, you'll be busy in Italy." "Why, it's sheer knight-errantry." "You may call it that," said Bellarion, and became thoughtful. Chapter to the Battle of Novi. The rest of this affair, this campaign against the too ambitious vicar, the King of France, is a matter of history, which you may read in the chronicles of Messacorio and elsewhere. With a powerful army numbering close upon 12,000 men, Facino descended upon Genoa, which surrendered without a blow. At first there was alarm at the advance of so large an army. The fear of pillage with its attendant violence ran through the Genoese, who took the precaution of sending their women and their valuables to the ships in the harbor. Then the representatives of the people went out to meet Facino, and to assure him that they would welcome him and the deliverance from a French yoke, provided that he would not bring his troops into the city. "The only purpose for which I could wish to do so," Facino answered from the litter to which he was confined by the gout, grown worse since he had left Alessandria, "would be to enforce the rightful claims of the Marquis of Montferrat. But if you will take him for your prince, my army need advance no nearer. On the contrary, I will withdraw it towards Novi to make of it a shield against the wrath of the Marshal Boucicault when he returns." And so it befell that, attended only by 500 of his own men, Theodore of Montferrat made his state entry into Genoa on the morrow, hailed as a deliverer by the multitude, whilst Facino fell back on Novi, there to lie in wait for Boucicault. Nor was his patience tried. Upon Boucicault confidently preparing for Facino's attack, the news of the happenings in Genoa fell like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Between fury and panic, he quitted Milan, and by his very haste destroyed what little chance he may ever have had of mending the situation. By forced marches, he reached the plains about Novi to find the road held against his jaded men, and here he piled error upon error. Being informed that Facino himself, incapacitated by the gout, had been carried that morning into Genoa, and that his army was commanded in his absence by his adoptive son Bellarion, the French commander decided to strike at once before Facino should recover and return to direct the operations in person. The ground was excellent for cavalry, and entirely of cavalry some 4,000 strong was Boucicault's main battle composed. Leading it in person, he hurled upon the enemy's center in a charge which he thought must irresistibly cleave through. Nor did the mass of infantry, of which Bellarion's center was composed, resist. It yielded ground before the furious onslaught of the French lances. Indeed, as if swayed by panic, it began to yield long before any contact was established, and the French in their rash exultation never noticed the orderliness of that swift retreat, never suspected the trap, until they were fast caught in it. For whilst the center yielded, the wings stood firm, and the wings were entirely composed of horse, the right commanded by the Piedmontese Trotta, the left by Carmignola, who, sulky and disgruntled at his supersession, in a supreme command which he deemed his right, had never wearied of denouncing this disposition of forces as an insensate reversal of all the known rules. Back and back, ever more swiftly fell the foot. On and on pressed the French, their lances couched, their voices already clamorously mocking these opponents, who were being swept away like leaves by the mere gust of the charge. Bellarion, riding in the rear of his retreating infantry, with a mounted trumpeter beside him, uttered a single word. A trumpet blast rang out, and before its note had died the retreat was abruptly checked. Königshofen's men, who formed the van of that center, suddenly drove the butts of their 15-foot German pikes into the ground. Each man of the two front ranks went down on one knee. A terrible hedge of spears suddenly confronted the men-at-arms of France, riding too impetuously in their confidence. 100 horses were piked in the first impact, then the impetus of those behind, striking the leading ranks which sought desperately to check, drove them forward onto those formidable German points. The entire charging mass was instantly thrown into confusion. "That," said Bellarion grimly, "will teach Boucicault to respect infantry in future. Sound the charge." The trumpeter wounded another blast, thrice repeated, and in answer, as Bellarion had preconcerted, the right and left wings, which had gradually been extending, wheeled about and charged the French on both flanks simultaneously. Only then did Boucicault perceive whither his overconfident charge had carried him. Vainly did he seek to rally and steady his staggering followers. They were enveloped, smashed, ridden down before they could recover. Boucicault himself, fighting like a man possessed, fighting, indeed, for very life, hewed himself a way out of that terrible press, and contrived to join the other two of the three battles into which he had divided his army and which were pressing forward now to the rescue. But they arrived too late. There was nothing left to rescue. The survivors of the flower of Boucicault's army had thrown down their arms and accepted quarter, and the reserves ran in to meet a solid enemy front, which drove wedges into their ranks and mercilessly battered them, until Boucicault, routed beyond redemption, drew off with what was left. A swift action, which was a model of the harmonious collaboration of the parts. Thus did Bellarion describe the Battle of Novi, which was to swell his ever-growing fame. Boucicault, as Bellarion said, had sought to grasp more than he could hold when he responded to John Maria's invitation. And at Novi he lost not only Milan, but Genoa as well. In ignominy he took the road to France, glad to escape with his life and some battered remnants of his army, and Italy knew him no more after that day. In the Fregoso Palace at Genoa, overlooking the harbor, where Theodore of Montferrat had taken up his quarters, and where the incapacitated Ficino was temporarily lodged, there was a great banquet on the following night to celebrate at once the overthrow of the French and the accession of Theodore as Prince of Genoa. It was attended by representatives of the 12 greatest families in the state, as well as by Ficino, hobbling painfully on a crutch, and his captains. And whilst the official hero of the hour was Theodore, the new prince, the real hero was Bellarion. He received without emotion, without any sign either of pride or modesty, the tribute lavishly paid him by illustrious men and distinguished women, by the adulatory congratulatory speech of Theodore, or the almost malicious stress which Carmignola laid on his good fortune. "You are well named Bellarion Fortunato," that splendid soldier had said. "I am still wondering what would have happened if Boucicault had perceived the trick in time." Bellarion was coldly amiable in his reply. "It will provide you with healthy mental exercise. Consider at the same time what might have happened if Buonterzo had fathomed our intentions at Travo, or Vigne had guessed my real purpose at Alessandria." Bellarion moved on, leaving Carmignola to bite his lip and digest the laughter of his brother captains. His interview later with Prince Theodore was more serious. From its outset, he mistrusted the fawning suavity of the courtly regent, so that, when at the end of compliments upon his prowess, the regent proposed to take him and his company into the pay of Montferrat at a stipend vastly in excess of that which Florence had lately paid him, Bellarion was not at all surprised. Two things became immediately clear. First, that Theodore desired greatly to increase his strength, the only reason for which could be the shirking, now that all his aims were accomplished, of his engagements towards Cicino. Second, that he took it for granted, as he had done before, that Bellarion was just a venal, self-seeking adventurer who would never permit considerations of honor to stand in the way of profit. And the cupidity and calculation now revealed in Bellarion's countenance assured Theodore that his skill in reading men had not been at fault on this occasion. "You offer me—" He broke off. Stealthily his glance swept the glittering groups that moved about the spacious white and gold room, to Ficino Cane, where he sat at the far end in a great crimson chair. He lowered his voice a little. "The loggia is empty, my lord. We shall be more private there." They sauntered forth to that covered balcony overlooking the great harbor, where ranks of shipping drawn up against the mole were slumbering under the stars. A great towering galley was moving across the water with furled sails, her gigantic oar blades flashing silver in the moonlight. With his glance upon that craft, his voice subdued, Bellarion spoke, and the close-set eyes of the tall, elegant regent strained to pierce the shadows about the young Condotiero's face. "This is a very noble offer, Lord Prince. I hope I shall never begrudge a man his worth." It was a speech true to the character he loved to assume. "You are a great soldier, Bellarion. That fact is now established and admitted." Bellarion did not contradict him. "I do not perceive at present your need for a great soldier, Highness. True, your proposals seem to argue plans already formed. But unless I know something of them, unless I may judge for myself the likely extent of the service you require, these generous terms may in effect prove an illusion." Theodore resumed his momentarily suspended breath. He even laughed a little, now that the venal reason for Bellarion's curiosity was supplied. But he deemed it wise to probe a little further. "You are, as I understand, under no present engagement to the Count of Biendrate." Bellarion's answer was very prompt. "Under none. In discharge of past favors, I engaged to assist him in the campaign against the Marshal Boucicault. That campaign is now ended, and with it my engagement. I am in the market, as it were, my lord." "That is what I assumed. Else, of course, I should not have come to you with my offer. I lose no time, because soon you will be receiving other proposals. That is inevitable. For the same reason I name a stipend which I believe is higher than any Condottiero has ever yet commanded. But you have not named a term. That was why I desired to know your plans, so that for myself I might judge the term." "I will make the engagement to endure for 3 years," said Theodore. "The proposal becomes generous. Indeed. Is it acceptable?" Bellarion laughed softly. "I should be greedy if it were not. It will carry the usual condition that you engage for such service as I may require, and against any whom circumstances may make my enemy." "Naturally," said Bellarion, but he seemed to falter a little. "Naturally," he repeated, "and yet—" He paused, and Theodore waited, craftily refraining from any word that should curb him in opening his mind. "And yet I should prefer that service against my lord Ficino be accepted." "You would prefer it?" said Theodore. "But do you make a condition?" Bellarion's hesitation revealed him to the regent for a man torn between interest and scruples. Weakly, at last, he said, "I would not willingly go in arms against him." "Not willingly? That I can understand. But you do not answer my question. Do you make it a condition?" Still Bellarion avoided answering. Would the condition make my employment impossible? And now it was Theodore who hesitated, or seemed to hesitate. "It would," he said at last. Very quickly he added, "Nothing is less likely than that Ficino and I should be opposed to each other. Yet you'll understand that I could not possibly employ a Condottiero who would have the right to desert me in such a contingency." "Oh, yes, I understand that. I have understood it from the first. I am foolish, I suppose, to hesitate where the terms are so generous." He sighed, a man whose conscience was in labor. "My lord Ficino could hardly blame me." He left the sentence unfinished, and Theodore, to end the rogue's hesitation, threw more weight into the scales. "And there will be guarantees," he said. "Guarantees? Ah! The lands of Ostia along the Tenero from Revigliasco to Margheria, to be made into a fief, and placed under your vicarship with the title of Count of Asti." Bellarion caught his breath. He turned to face the Marquis, and in the moonlight his countenance looked very white. "My lord, you promise something that is not yours to bestow. It is to make it mine that I require your service. I am frank, you see." Bellarion saw more. He saw the infernal subtlety with which this tempter went to work. He made clear his intentions, which must amount to no less than the conquest and occupation of all those rich lands which lay between high and low Montferrat. To accomplish this, Alessandria, Valenza, and a score of other cities now within the Duchy of Milan would pass under his dominion. Inevitably, then, must there be war with Ficino, who to the end of his days would be in arms to preserve the integrity of the duchy. And Theodore offered this condottiero, whose services he coveted, a dazzling reward to be gained only when those aims were fulfilled. On that seducer's arm Bellarion placed a hand that shook with excitement. "You mean this, my lord? It is a solemn undertaking." With difficulty, Theodore preserved his gravity. How shrewdly had he not taken the measure of this greedy rogue. "Your patent shall be made out in anticipation, and signed at the same time as the contract." Bellarion stared out to sea. "Count Bellarion of Asti," he murmured, a man dazzled, dazed. Suddenly he laughed, and laughing surrendered his last scruple, as Theodore was already confident that he would. "When do we sign, Lord Prince?" "Tomorrow morning, Lord Count," Theodore answered with a tight-lipped smile, and on that, the matter satisfactorily concluded, they quitted the loggia and parted company. They met again for the signing of the documents early on the following morning in the regent's closet, in the presence of the notary who had drawn up the contract at Theodore's dictation of two gentlemen of Montferrat, and of Werner von Stoffel, who accompanied Bellarion and who, as Bellarion's lieutenant, was an interested party. The notary read first the contract, which Bellarion pronounced correct in all particulars, and then the ennobling parchment whereby Theodore created him Count of Asti, anticipatorily detailing the lands which he was to hold in fief. This document, already signed and sealed, was delivered to Bellarion together with the contract, which he was now invited to sign. The notary dipped a quill and proffered it, but Bellarion looked at the regent. "Documents," he said, "are perishable, and the matter contained in these is grave, for which reason I have brought with me a witness, who in case of need can hereafter testify to your undertaking, my lord." The Marquis frowned. "Let Messer Stoffel examine them for himself, then." "Not Messer Stoffel. The witness I prefer waits in your antechamber." "Highness!" He stepped quickly to the door, followed by the regent's surprised glance. He pulled it open, and at once Ficino was revealed to them, grave of countenance, leaning upon his crutch. The regent made a noise in his throat, as Ficino hobbled in to take the parchments which Bellarion proffered him. Thereafter there was a spell of dreadful silence, broken at last by the Lord Theodore, who was unable longer to control himself. "You miserable trickster, you low-born, swaggering Judas. I should have known better than to trust you. I should have known that you be true to your false, shifty nature. You dirty fox." A trickster, a Judas, a fox. Bellarion appealed mildly to the company against the injustice of these epithets. But why such violence of terms? Could I, in loyalty to my adoptive father, put my signature to this contract until I had received his approval? "You mock me, you vile son of a dog." Ficino looked up. His face was stern, his eyes smoldered. "Think of some fouler epithet, my lord, so that I may cast it at you. So far no term that you have used will serve my need." That gave Theodore pause in his reviling of another, but only for a moment. Almost at once he was leaping furiously towards Ficino. The feral nature under his silken exterior was now displayed. He was a man of his hands, this regent of Montferrat, and, beggared of words to meet the present case, he was prepared for deeds. Suddenly he found Bellarion in his way, the bold, mocking eyes level with his own, and Bellarion's right hand was behind his back, where the heavy dagger hung. "Shall we be calm?" Bellarion was saying. "There are half a dozen men of mine in the anteroom if you want violence." He fell back, and for all that his eyes still glared, he made an obvious effort to regain his self-command. It was difficult in the face of Ficino's contemptuous laughter, and the words Ficino was using. "You treacherous slug, I place you in possession of Vercelli. I make you Prince of Genoa. before calling upon you to strike a single blow on my behalf, and you prepare to use this newfound power against me. You'll drive me from Alessandria. You'll seduce for me the best among my captains to turn his weapons against me in your service. If Bellarion had been an ingrate like yourself, if he had not been staunch and loyal, whom you dare to call a Judas, I might have known nothing of this until too late to guard myself. But I know you now, you dastardly usurper, and by the bones of God, your days are numbered. You'll prepare for war on Facino, will you? Prepare then, for by the passion, that war is coming to you. Theodore stood there white to the lips, between his two dismayed gentlemen, and said no word in answer. Facino, with curling lip, considered him. I'd never have believed it if I had not read thee for myself, he added. Then proffer the documents to Bellarion again. Give him back his parchments, and let us go. The sight of the creature nauseates me. And without more, he hobbled out. Bellarion lingered to tear the parchments across and across. He cast them from him, bowed ironically, and was going out with Stoffel when the regent found his voice at last. You kite-hearted trickster, what stipend have you wrung from Facino as the price of this betrayal? Bellarion paused on the threshold. No stipend, my lord, he answered equably. Merely a condition that so soon as the affairs of Milan are settled, he will see justice done to your nephew, the Marquis John Giacomo, now of age to succeed, and put a definite end to your usurpation. His sheer amazement betrayed from him the sudden question, what is John Giacomo to you, villain? Something he is, or else I should never have been at pains to make him safe from you by demanding him as a hostage. I have been laboring for him for longer than you think. Highness, you have been laboring for him? You? In whose pay? Bellarion sighed. You must be supposing me a tradesman, even when I am really that quite senseless thing, a knight-errant. And he went out with Stoffel. Chapter 3, Facino's Return. A strong party of men-at-arms rode out of Genoa that morning, their corselets flashing in the sunshine, and took the upland road by the valley of the Scrivia towards Novi and Facino's camp. In their midst went a mule litter, wherein Facino brooded upon the baseness and ingratitude of men, and asked himself whether perhaps his ambitious countess were not justified of her impatience with him, because he labored for purposes other than the aggrandizement of himself. From Novi he dispatched Carmagnola with a strong escort to Casale to bring the Countess Beatrice, thence to Alessandria, without loss of time. He had no mind to allow Theodore to hold her as a hostage to set against John Giacomo, who remained with Facino. 3 days after leaving Novi, Facino's army, reduced by Theodore's contingent of 3,000 men, which had been left behind, but still in great strength, reached Vigevano, and halted there to encamp again outside the town. Facino's vanity was the main reason. He would not cross the Ticino until he could sit a horse again, so that he might ride lance on thigh into Milan. Already his condition was greatly improved under the ministrations of a Genoese physician named Mombelli, renowned for his treatment of the podagric habit, who was now in Facino's train. A week passed, and Facino, now completely restored, was only restrained from pushing on by the arguments of the physician. Meanwhile, however, if he did not go to Milan, many from Milan were coming to him. Amongst the first to arrive was a firebrand Pustula of Venegono, who out of his passionate vindictiveness came to urge Facino to hang John Maria and make himself Duke of Milan, assuring him of the support of all the Ghibelline faction. Facino heard him without emotion and would commit himself to nothing. Amongst the last to arrive was the Duke himself, in a rash trustfulness which revealed the desperate view he must take of his own case and of the helplessness to which his folly and faithlessness had reduced him. He came accompanied by his evil genius Antonio Delatorre, the fop Lanate, the captain of his guard Bertino Manegazza, and a paltry escort of 100 lances. With those 3 attending him, he was received by Facino in the house of the ducal prefect of Vigevano. Your Highness honors me by this proof of your trust in my integrity, said Facino, bending to kiss the jeweled ducal hand. Integrity? The Duke's grotesque face was white, his red eyebrows drawn together in a scowl. Is it integrity that brings you in arms against me, Facino? Not against you, Lord Duke. Never yet have I stood in arms against your Highness. It is upon your enemies that I make war. I have no aim but the restoration of peace to your dominions. Fine words on the lips of a mutinous traitor, sneered the Duke. He flung himself petulantly into a chair. "If your highness believed that, you would not dare to come here." "Not dare? God's bones, man. Are these words for me? I am Duke of Milan. I studied to remember it. Highness," said Facino, and the rumblings of anger in his voice drove Delatorre to pluck at his master's sleeve. Thus warned, John Maria changed the subject, but not the tone. "You know why I am here. To permit me, I hope, to place myself at your potency's commands." "Ah, you make me sick with your fair words." He grew sullen. "Come, man, what is your price?" "My price, highness? What does your highness conceive I have to sell?" "A little patience with his magnificence, my lord," Delatorre begged. "I thought I was displaying it," said Facino. "Otherwise, it might be very bad for everybody." He was really growing angry. And now the idiot Duke must needs go prod him into fury. "What's that? Do you threaten me? Why, here's an insolent dog." Facino turned livid with passion. A tall fellow among his captains, very noble-looking in cloth of silver under a blue houppelande, laughed aloud. The pale, bulging eyes of John Maria sought him out venomously. "You laugh, knave?" he snarled, and came to his feet, outraged by the indignity. "What is here for laughter?" Bellarion laughed again as he answered. "Yourself, Lord Duke, who in yourself are nothing. You are Duke of Milan at present by the grace of God, and the favor of Facino Cane, yet you do not hesitate to offend against both." "Quiet, Bellarion." Facino growled. "I need no advocate." "Bellarion," the Duke echoed, glaring malevolently. "I remember you, and remember you I shall. You shall be taught. By God, it is your highness shall be taught." Facino crashed into the threatening speech, roaring like a thunder god. "Get you hence. Back to your Milan until I come to give you the lesson that you need. And thank God that you are your father's son, and I have grace enough to remember it, for otherwise you'd never go hence alive. Away with you, and get yourself schooled in manners before we meet again, or as God's my life, I'll birch you with these hands." Terrified, cowering before that raging storm, the line of which had never yet broken about his ducal head, John Maria shrank back until his three companions were between himself and Facino. Delatorre, almost trembling, sought to pacify the angry condottiero. My lord, this is not worthy." "Not worthy? Is it worthy that I shall be called dog by a cross-grained brat to whom I played the foster father? Out of my sight, sir. Out of my sight, all of you. The door, Bellarion. The Duke of Milan to the door." They went without another word, fearing, indeed, that another word might be their last. But they did not yet return to Milan. They remained in Vigevano, and that evening Delatorre came seeking audience again of Facino to make the Duke's peace with him. And Facino, having swallowed his rage by then, consented to receive his highness once more. The young man came, this time well-schooled in prudence, to announce that he was prepared to give Facino peaceful entrance into Milan and to restore him to his office of ducal governor. In short, that he was prepared to accord all that which he had no power to refuse. Facino's answer was brief and clear. He would accept the office again, provided that it was bestowed upon him for a term of 3 years, and the bestowal guaranteed by an oath of fealty to be sworn upon his hands by the syndics of the Grand Council. Further, the castle of Porta Giovia was to be delivered into his keeping absolutely, and not only the Guelphic San Severino, who now held the office of Podesta, but all other Guelphs holding offices of state must be dismissed. Lastly, Antonio Delatorre, whom Facino accused of being at the root of most of the trouble which had distracted Milan, must go into banishment together with Lanate. This last was a condition that John Maria would not swallow. He swore it was a vile attempt to deprive him of all his friends. Thus the conference ended inconclusively, and it was not until 3 weeks later that the Duke finally yielded and accepted Facino's terms in their entirety. On the evening of Wednesday, the 6th of November that year, attended by a large company, Facino Cane, Count of Biendrate, rode into Milan to resume his governorship, a governorship which he was resolved to render absolute this time. They entered the city in a downpour of rain, notwithstanding which the streets were thronged by the people who turned out to welcome the man in whom they beheld their savior. And in the old Burletto, the young Duke, without a single friendly Guelph at hand to comfort him, sat listening to that uproar, gnawing his fingernails and shuddering with rage and spite. It becomes necessary, however, to remember, lest we should be swept along by this stream of Viscontian history, that this present chronicle is concerned not with the fortunes of Milan, but with those of Bellarion, and that in these Ficino, Cane, and John Maria Visconti are concerned only to the extent of the part they bore in molding them. In the confused pages of old Corio you may read in detail, though you may not always clearly understand, the events that followed upon Ficino's triumphant return to Milan. You will gather that the strength in which he was known to be gave pause to Malatesta's plans to seize the duchy, that in fact the Archguelph chose to content himself with his usurpation of the lordship of Brescia and Bergamo, and in Bergamo he remained until Ficino went to seek him there some 2 years later. If he did not go before, it was because other more immediate and active enemies of Milan claimed his attention. Vignate was in arms again, as were also Astor Visconti and his nephew Giovanni Carlo, and a host of lesser insurgents, chief of whom was the Duke's own brother, that Filippo Maria Visconti, who was Count of Pavia, by the Ghibellines who had fled to him from Milan during the days of Malatesta and Busicolt's domination. Filippo Maria had been flattered into believing that he was that party's only hope in northern Italy. His ambition thus aroused, he was ready to take advantage of the general distraction and to appropriate for himself the ducal claimus. To this purpose was he arming when Ficino returned to Milan, and news of his preparations reached Ficino whilst he was suppressing the various rebellious outbreaks in the Milanese, stamping out the embers of revolt in such places as Desio and Gorgonzola. Only when he had restored order, established a proper administration, and so brought back tranquility to that harassed land, did he turn his attention to the menace of the enemies farther afield. And the first of these was Filippo Maria. He marched on Pavia, carried the city by assault, and put to sack, choosing of all nights in the year for that operation the night of Christmas. That sack of Pavia is one of the most unsparing and terrible in the terrible history of sacks, and the deed remains a blot upon the fame of a soldier who, although rough and occasionally even brutal in his ways, was yet a leader of high principles and a high sense of duty. Thereafter he dealt with Filippo Maria much as he had dealt with his ducal brother. He appointed himself governor of the young man's dominions, filled the offices of state with men in his own confidence, and completely stripped the count authority. The fat, flabby young prince submitted in a singularly apathetic fashion. He was of solitary, studious habits, a recluse, almost savagely shy, shunning the society of men because of his excessive consciousness of his own grotesque ugliness. The spark of ambition that had been struck from him having been thus summarily quenched, he retired to his books again, and let Ficino have his way with the state, nor complained so long as Ficino left him in enjoyment of the little that was really necessary to his eremitic ways. Ficino made now of Pavia his headquarters, coming to dwell in the great castle itself, and bringing thither from Alessandria his countess. And with the Countess of Beindrake came also the Princess Valeria of Montferrat, to rejoin at last her brother, who continued throughout in Ficino's train. The princess had left Casale with the Countess when Carmignola appeared there as Ficino's envoy with an escort. Her going had been in the nature of a flight, whose object had been first to rejoin her cherished brother, and second, to remove herself from the power of her uncle, which, in all the circumstances made clear by Carmignola, seemed prudent. It is possible that she may also have hoped by her presence near Ficino to stimulate him into fulfillment of the threat against the regent on which he had parted from him in Genoa. But Ficino had still more immediate matters to rectify before coming to the affair of the Lord Theodore. The regent must wait his turn. He moved against Canturio in the following May and made short work of it. The campaign against Crema followed, and meanwhile Bellarion, with a condata increased to 1,500 men, and supported by Königshofen, had marched out of Milan to deal with the rebellious Bignate, whom in the end he finally and definitely defeated. That done, he returned to Milan, where, ever since Ficino's descent upon Pavia, he had held the position of Ficino's deputy, and had earned respect and even affection by the equable wisdom of his rule. All this in greater detail you will find set forth by Corio and Fra Serafino of Imola. And it is Fra Serafino who tells us that Ficino, determined that Bellarion should not suffer by the loyalty which had made him refuse the county of Asti, had constrained John Maria to create him Count of Gavi, and the commune of Milan to enlist the services of his condata for 2 years at a stipend of 30,000 ducats monthly, chapter for the Count of Pavia. In the vast park of Pavia, the trees stood leafless and black against a white shroud of snow that covered the chilled earth. The river Ticino gurgled and swirled about the 100 granite pillars which carried the great roof bridge, 500 feet in length, spanning its gray and turgid waters. Beyond this, Pavia the learned reared above white roofs her 100 snow-capped towers to the gray December sky, and beyond the city, isolated, within the girdle of moat that was both wide and deep, stood the massive square castle, pink as coral, strong as iron, at once impregnable fortress and unrivaled palace, one of the great monuments of Viscontian power and splendor, described by Petrarch as the princeliest pile in Italy. The pride of the place was the library, a spacious square chamber in one of the rectangular towers that rose at each of the four corners of the castle. The floor was of colored mosaics, figuring birds and beasts, the ceiling of ultramarine star-flecking gold, and along the walls was ranged a collection of some 900 manuscript parchment volumes bound in velvet and damask or in gold and silver brocades. Their contents contained all that was known of theology, astrology, medicine, music, geometry, rhetoric, and the other sciences. This room was a favorite haunt of the lonely, morose, and studious boy, the great John Galeazzo's younger son, Filippo Maria Visconti, Count of Pavia. He sat there now, by the log fire that hissed and spluttered and flamed on the cavernous hearth, diffusing warmth and a fragrance of pine throughout the chamber. And with him at chess sat the Lord Bellarion Kane, Count of Gavy, one of the newfound friends who had invaded his loneliness, and broken through the savage shyness which solitude and friendlessness had set about him like a shell. The others, the dark and handsome Countess of Biandrate, the fair, now almost ethereal Princess of Montferrat, and that sturdier counterpart herself, her brother, were in the background by one of the two light windows with trefoil arches springing from slender monials. The princess was bending low over a frame, embroidering in red and gold and blue an altar cloth for San Pietro in seal d'oro. The countess was yawning over a beautifully illuminated copy of Petrarch's Trionfo d'Amor. The boy sat idle and listless between them, watching his sister's white tapering fingers as they flashed to and fro. Presently he rose, sauntered across to the players, drew up a stool, and sat down to watch the game over which they brooded silently. A crutch lay beside Bellarion, and his right leg was thrust out stiff and unbending, to explain why he sat here on this day of late December playing chess, whilst the campaign against Malatesta continued to rage in the hills of Bergamo. He was suffering the penalty of the pioneer, having already demonstrated to his contemporaries that infantry, when properly organized and maneuvered, can hold its own in the field against cavalry. He had been turning his attention to artillery. 2 months ago, he had mounted a park of guns under the walls of Bergamo with the intention of breaching them. But at the outset of his operations, a bombard had burst, killing 2 of his bombardiers and breaking his thigh, thus proving Ficino's contention that artillery was a danger only to those who employed it. The physician Mombelli, who still continued in Ficino's train, had set the bone, whereafter Bellarion had been carefully packed into a mule litter, and by roads, which torrential rains had reduced to quagmires, he had been dispatched to Pavia to get himself mended. His removal from the army was regretted by everybody with 2 exceptions. Carmignola, glad to be relieved of a brother captain by comparison, with whose military methods his own were constantly suffering in the general esteem, and Filippo Maria, we discovered in Bellarion a chess player who was not only his equal but his master, and who in other ways won the esteem of that very friendless boy. The Princess Valeria was dismayed that this man, who out of unconquerable prejudice she continued to scorn and mistrust, should become for a season her fellow inquiline. And it was in vain that John Giacomo, who in the course of his reformation had come to conceive a certain regard for Bellarion, sought to combat his sister's deep-rooted prejudice. When he insisted that it was by Bellarion's contriving that he had been removed from his uncle's control, she had been moved to vehement scorn of his credulity. That is what the trickster would have us think. He no more than carried out the orders of the Count of Biandrate. His whole life bears witness to his false nature. Nay, now, Valeria, nay, you'll not deny that he is what all Italy now proclaims him, one of the greatest captains of his time. And how has he made himself that? Is it by knightly qualities, by soldierly virtues? All the world knows that he prevails by guile and trickery. You've been listening to Carmignola, said her brother. He would give an eye for Bellarion's skill. You're but a boy, she reminded him with some asperity. And Carmignola, of course, is a handsome man. She crimsoned at the sly tone. On odd visits to Pavia, Carmignola had been very attentive to the princess, employing all of Peacock's arts of self-display to dazzle her. He is an honest gentleman, she countered hotly. It is better to trust an upright, honest soldier than a sly schemer whose falsehood has been proven to us. If he schemes my ruin for my uncle's profit, he goes about it oddly, neglecting opportunities. She looked at him with compassion. Bellarion never aims where he looks. It is the world says that of him, not I. And at what do you suspect that he is aiming now? Her deep eyes grew thoughtful. What if he serves our uncle to destroy us, only so that in the end he may destroy our uncle to his own advantage? What if he should aim at a throne? John Giacomo thought the notion fantastic, the fruit of too much ill-ordered brooding. He said so, laughing. If you had studied his methods, Giannino, you would not say that. See how he has wrought his own advancement. In 4 short years, the son of nobody, without so much as name his own, has become the Knight Bellarion, the Lord Bellarion of the Company of the White Dog, and now the Lord Count of Gavy, holding the rich lands of Gavy in feud. One there was whom I have told her things which would have corrected her judgment, and that was Ficino's Countess. For the Lady Beatrice knew the truth of those events in Montferrat, which were at the root of the Princess Valeria's bitter prejudice, of which also she was aware. You hate him very bitterly, the Countess told her once when Bellarion had been the subject of their talk. Would not you, if you were in my place? And the Countess, looking at her with those long, indolent eyes of hers, an inscrutable smile on her red lips, had answered with languorous slowness, In your place it is possible that I should. The tone and the smile had intrigued the princess for many a day thereafter, but either she was too proud to ask what the Countess had meant, or else afraid. When after some 8 weeks' abed, Bellarion had begun to hobble about the castle, and it was impossible for the princess entirely to avoid him. She was careful never to be alone where he might so surprise her, using him when they met in the company of others with distant, frigid courtesy, which is perhaps the most piercing of all hostility. If it wounded Bellarion, he gave no sign. He was, and therein lay half the secret of his strength, a very patient man. He was content to wait for the day when by his contriving the reckoning should be presented to the Marquis Theodore, and she should know at last whose servant he really was. Meanwhile, he modeled his demeanor upon her own. He did not seek her company, nor indeed that of any in the castle save Filippo Maria, with whom he would spend long hours at chess, or instruct him out of his own deep learning supported by one or another of the treatises in that fine library. Until the coming of Bellarion, the Count of Pavia had believed himself a strong chess player. Bellarion had made him realize that his knowledge of the game was elementary. Where against former opponents he had swept to easy triumphs, he now groaned and puffed and sweated over the board to lessen the ignominy of his inevitable defeats. Today, however, he was groaning less than usual. He had piled up a well-supported attack on Bellarion's flank, and for the first time in weeks, for these games had begun whilst Bellarion was still abed, he saw victory ahead. With a broad smile, he brought up a bishop further to strengthen the mass of his attack. He saw his way to give check in 3 and checkmate in 4 moves. Although only in his 20th year, he was of a hog-like bulk, of no more than middle height. He looked tall when seated, for all the length of him was in his flabby, paunchy body. His limbs were short and shapeless. His face was as round as the full moon and as pale. A great dewlap spread beneath his chin, and his neck behind hung in loose fat folds upon his collar, so that the back of his head, which was flat, seemed to slope inwards towards a crown. His short black hair was smooth and sleek as a velvet cap, and a fringe of across his forehead descended almost to the heavy black eyebrows, thus masking the intellectual depth of the only noble feature of that ignoble countenance. Of his father, all that he had inherited physically was a hooked, predatory nose. His mouth was coarsely shaped, and its lines confirmed the impression of cruelty you gather from the dark eyes, which were small and lackluster as a snake's. And the impression was a true one, for the soul of this shy, morose young prince was not without its share of that Sadic cruelty which marked all the men of his race. To meet the bishop's move, Bellarion advanced a knight. The prince's laugh rang through the silent room. It was a shrill, almost womanish laugh, and it was seldom heard. High-pitched, too, was the voice that followed. You but delay the inevitable, Bellarion, he said, and took the knight. But the move of the knight, which had appeared purely defensive to the prince in his intentness upon his own attack, had served to uncover the file of Bellarion's queen. Supports had been previously, and just as cunningly provided. Bellarion advanced his hand, a long, beautiful hand upon which glowed a great carved sapphire set in brilliance, the blue and white that were his colors. Forth flashed his queen across the board. "Checkmate, Lord Prince," said Bellarion quietly, and sank back smiling into brocaded chair. Filippo Maria stared unbelieving at the board. The lines of his mouth drooped, and his great, pendulous cheeks trembled. Almost he seemed on the point of tears. "God rot you, Bellarion. Always is it the same. I plan and build, and whilst you seem to do no more than defend, you are preparing a death stroke in an unexpected quarter." Between jest and earnest he added, "You slippery rogue, always you defeat me by a trick." The Princess Valeria looked up from her embroidery on the word. Bellarion caught the movement and the glance in his direction. He knew the thought behind, and it was that thought he answered. "In the field, my opponents use the same word to decry me, but those who are with me applaud my skill." He laughed. "Truth is an elusive thing, Highness, as Pontius Pilate knew. The aspect of fact depends upon the angle from which you view it." Filippo Maria sat back, his great chin sunk to his breast, his podgy white hands gripping the arms of his chair, his humor sullen. "I'll play no more today," he said. The Countess rose and crossed the room with a rustle of stiff brocade of black and gold. "Let me remove the board," she said. "A vile, dull game. I wonder that you can waste such hours upon it." Filippo Maria raised his beady eyes. They kindled as they observed her, raking her generous yet supple lines from head to foot. It was not the first time that the watchful Bellarion had seen him look so at Facino's lady, nor the first time that he had seen her wantonly display herself to provoke that unmistakable regard. She bent now to the board, and Filippo's smoldering glance was upon the warm ivory beauty of her neck, and the swell of her breast revealed by the low-cut gown. "It is human to despise what we do not understand." Bellarion was answering her. "You defend the game, of course, since you excel in it. That is what you love, Bellarion, to excel, to wield mastery. Do we not all? Do not you, yourself, Madonna, glory in the power your beauty gives you?" She looked at Filippo. Her heavy eyelids drooped. "Behold him turned courtier, my lord. He perceives beauty in me." "He would be blind else," said the fat youth, greatly daring. And the next moment, in a reaction of shyness, a mottled flush was staining his unhealthy pallor. Lower drooped the lady's eyelids, until a line of black lashes lay upon her cheek. "The game," John Giacomo interposed, "is a very proper one for princes. Messer Bellarion told me so." "He means, child," Filippo answered him, "that it teaches him a bitter moral, that whilst the state depends upon the prince himself is entirely dependent upon others, being capable in his own person of little more than his meanest pawn." "To teach that lesson to a despot," said Bellarion, "was a game invented by an Eastern philosopher. And the most potent piece upon the board, as in the state, is the queen, symbolizing woman." Thus Filippo Maria, his eyes full upon the Countess again. Bellarion laughed. Aye, he knew his world, that ancient Oriental. But he did not laugh as the days passed, and he observed the growing lechery in the beady eyes with which the Count Pavia watched the Lady Beatrice's every movement, and the Lady Beatrice's provocative complacency under that vigilance. One day, at last, coming upon the Countess alone in that library, Bellarion unmasked the batteries he had been preparing. He hobbled across to the arched window by which she was seated, and leaning against its monial, looked out upon the desolate park. The snows had gone, washed away by rains, and since these had come a frost under which the ground lay now as gray and hard as iron. "They will be feeling the rigors of the winter in the camp under Bergamo," he said, moving, as ever, obliquely to the attack. "They will sow. Facino should have gone into winter quarters. That would mean recommencing in the spring a job that is half done already. Yet with his gout and the infirmities of age, it might prove wiser in the end. Each age has its own penalties. Madonna, it is not only the elderly among humanity who need compassion. Wisdom oozes from you like sweat from another." There was a tartness in her accents. "If I were your biographer, Bellarion, I should write of you as the soldier sage or the philosopher at arms. Propped on his crutch in his one sound leg, Bellarion considered her, his head on one side, and fetched a sigh. You are very beautiful, Madonna. She was startled. God save us, she cried. Does the soldier sage contain a mere man after all? Your mouth, Madonna, is too sweetly formed for acids. The choicest fruits, sir, have an alloy of sharpness. What else about me finds favor in your eyes? In my eyes, Madonna, are circumspect. They do not prowl hungrily over another's pastures. She looked at him between anger and apprehension, and slowly a wave of scarlet came to stain her face and bosom, to tell him that she understood. He lowered himself carefully to a chair, thrusting out his damaged leg, to the knee joint of which articulation was only just beginning to return. I was saying, Madonna, that they will be feeling the rigors of the winter in the camp under Bergamo. There was a hard frost last night, and after the frost there will be rains under which the hills thereabouts will melt in mud. He sighed again. You would regret, Madonna, to exchange without the ease and comfort of Pavia. You have the fever again. I am not thinking of making that exchange. No, I am thinking of it for you. You, Saint Mary, and do you dispose of me? It will be cold up there, Madonna, but you need cooling. Coolness restores judgment. It will bring you back to a sense of duty to your Lord. She came to her feet beside him, quivering with anger. Almost he thought her intention was to strike him. Have you come here to spy upon me? Of course. Now you know why I broke my leg. She looked unutterable scorn. The Princess Valeria is right in her opinion of you, in her disdain of you. His eyes grew sad. If you were generous, Madonna, nay, if you were merely honest, you would not embrace her opinions. You would correct them, for you have a knowledge that would suffice to do so. But you are not honest. If you were, there would be no need for me to speak now in defense of the honor of your absent lord. Is it for you to say I am not honest? There was now more sorrow than indignation in her voice, and tears were gathering in her eyes to deepen their sapphire hue. God knows I have been honest with you, Bellarion. It is this very honesty you abuse in your present misjudgment of me. Oh, me miserable. It was the cry of a wounded soul. She sank down again into her chair. Self-pity welled in her to drown all else. I am to be starved of everything. If ever woman was pitiable, I am that woman. And you, Bellarion, you of all living men that know my heart, can find for me only cruelty and reproach. It moved him not at all. The plea was too inconsequent and illogical, and the display of a lack of reason repelled him like a physical defect. Your plaint, Madonna, is that Facino will not make you a duchess. He may do so yet if you are patient. Her tears had suddenly ceased. You know something, she exclaimed in a hushed voice. The rogue fooled her with that illusion, whilst refraining from using words which might afterwards be turned against him. I know that you will lose the chance, if meanwhile you should cease to be Facino's wife. If you were so mad as to become the leman of another, you know as well as I do that the Lord Facino would put you from him. What should you be then? That is why I am your friend, when I think of the camp at Bergamo for you. Slowly she dried her eyes. Carefully she removed all stains of tears. It consumed a little time. Then she rose and went to him and took his hand. Thank you, Bellarion, my friend. Her voice was hushed and tender. You need have no fear for me. She paused a moment. What has my lord said to you of his intent? Nay, nay, he laughed. I betray no confidences. The trickster's tone was a confidence in itself. He swept on. You bid me have no fear for you. But that is not enough. Princes are reckless folk. I'd not have you remain in jeopardy. Oh, but Bergamo, she cried out, to be encamped in winter. You need not go so far nor under canvas. In your place, Madonna, I should retire to Melegnano. The castle is at your disposal. It is pleasanter than Pavia. Pleasanter, in that loneliness. It is the company here that makes it prudent. And you may take the Princess Valeria and her brother with you. Come, Madonna. Will you trifle with fate at such a time? Will you jeopardize a glorious destiny for the sake of an obese young lordling? She considered, her face fretful. Tell me, she begged again. "What my lord has divulged to you of his intentions? Have I not said enough already?" The entrance of Filippo Maria at that moment saved him the need of further invention. It perturbed him not at all that the prince's round white face should darken at the sight of them so close and fond. She was warned. Her greed of power and honor would curb her wantonness and ensure her withdrawal to Melegnano as he urged. Bellarion glowed with the satisfaction of a battle won, nor troubled about the deceit he had practiced. Chapter 5 Justice. The Epiphany mummeries were long overpast. The iron hand of winter was withdrawn from the land. In the great forest of Pavia, where John Galeazzo had loved to hunt, the trees were breaking into bud before Bellarion's condition permitted him to think of quitting the ease of Filippo Maria's castle. His leg had mended well. The knee joint had recovered its suppleness, and only a slight limp remained. He spoke of returning to Bergamo. "This lotus eating has endured too long already," he told the prince in answer to the latter's remonstrances. For Filippo Maria was reluctant to part with one who in many ways had beguiled for him the tedium of his lonely life, rendered lonelier than ever before by the withdrawal of the Countess of Biandrate, who had gone with the Montferrine princess to Melegnano. But it was not written that Filippo Maria should be left alone, for on the very eve of Bellarion's intended departure, Facino himself was borne into the castle of Pavia, crippled by an attack of gout of severity, which had compelled him to leave his camp just as he was preparing to reap the fruits of his long and patient siege. He had lost weight, and his face, out of which the healthy tan had departed, was gray and drawn. His hair from fulvid, that it had been, was almost white, but the spirit within remained unchanged, indomitable, and intolerant of this enforced inertia of the flesh. He was put to bed immediately on his arrival, for he was in great pain and swore that the gout, which he called by all manner of evil names, had got into his stomach. Mombelli warned me there was danger of it. "Where is Mombelli?" Bellarion asked. He stood with Filippo Maria by the canopied bed in a spacious chamber in the northern tower, adjacent to the Hall of Mirrors. "Mombelli, devil take his soul, left me a month ago, when I seemed well, to go to Duke John Maria, who desired to appoint him his physician. I've sent for him again to the Duke. Meanwhile, some Pavese doctor will be required to give me ease." He groaned with pain. Then, recovering, rapped out his orders to Bellarion. "It's a mercy you are recovered, for you are needed at Bergamo. Meanwhile, Carmignola commands there, but has my orders to surrender his authority to you on your arrival." It was an order which Carmignola did not relish, as he plainly showed when Bellarion reached the camp 2 days later. But he dared not disobey it. Bellarion examined the dispositions, but changed nothing. He carried forward the plans already made by Facino. The siege could be tightened no further, and, considering the straits to which Malatesta must be reduced, there could be little point in wasting lives on assault. A week after Bellarion's coming there rode into the great camp of green tents under the walls of Bergamo, a weary, excited fellow all splashed with mud from the fury of his riding, brought, by the guards who had checked his progress, to Facino's large and handsomely equipped pavilion, pitched beside the racing waters of the Serios. This slight, swarthy, fierce-eyed man proved to be that stormy petrel, Giovanni Pustula Venegono. Bellarion rose from the couch, covered by a black bearskin on which he had been reclining, and closed a beautifully illuminated copy of Juvenal's Satires, which had been a parting gift from Filippo Maria. His gesture dismissed the Swiss halberdiers, who had ushered in this visitor. The very name of Venegono was of ill omen, and ill omen was the man's haggard countenance now, and his own announcement, "I bring evil tidings, Lord Count." "You are consistent," said Bellarion, "a great quality." Venegono stared at him. "Give me to drink," he begged. "God, how I thirst! I have ridden from Pavia, without pause save to change horse at Caravaggio." "From Pavia?" Bellarion's tone and manner changed. Apprehension showed in both. But not on that account was he neglectful of the needs of his guest. On an ample square table in mid-tent stood a jug of wine and some beautiful drinking cups, their bowls of beaten gold, their stems of choicely wrought silver, beside a dish of sweetmeats, bread, and a small loaf of cheese. Bellarion poured a cup of strong red Valtelline. Venegono drained it. I am consistent, as you say. And so is that hell-spawn John Maria Visconti. Of his consistency, mine, by your leave." He flung himself wearily into the cushioned fallstool by the table and set down his cup. Bellarion nodded and resumed his seat on the bearskin. What has happened in Pavia? In Pavia, nothing. Nothing yet. I rode there to warn Facino of what is happening in Milan. But Facino, the man is ill. He could do nothing if he would. So I come on to you, and now, leaning forward and scarcely pausing to draw breath, he launched the news he had ridden so desperately to bring. Delatorre is back in Milan, recalled by Gian Maria. Bellarion waited, but nothing further came. Well, man, he asked, is that all? All? Does it mean so little to you that you ask that? Don't you know that this damn Guelph, whom Facino banished when he should have hanged him, has been throughout the inspirer of all the evil that has been wrought against Facino and against all the Ghibellines of Milan? Don't you understand that his return bodes ill? What can he do? What can Gian Maria do? Their wings are clipped. They're growing fresh ones. Venegono came to his feet again, his weariness forgotten in his excitement. Since Delatorre's secret return a month ago, orders have been sent to Theodore of Montferrat, to the Batter of Ignati, to the Este, and even to Store Visconti, to invite them into a league. Bellarion laughed. Let them league. If they are so mad as to do so, Facino will smash their league into shards when this Bergamo business is over. You forget that under his hand is the strongest army in Italy today. We muster over 12,000 men. My God, I seem to be listening to Facino himself. Venegono slobbered in his excitement, his eyes wild. It was thus he answered me. Why, then, have trouble to come to me? In the hope that you would see what he will not. You talk as if the army were all. You forget that Gian Maria is a thing of venom, like the emblem of his accursed house. Where there is venom and the will to use it, beware the occasion. If anything should happen to Facino, what hope will remain for the Ghibellines of Milan? What should happen to Facino? At what are you hinting, man? Venegono looked at him between rage and compassion. Where's Mombelli? He asked. Why is he not with Facino now that Facino needs him? Do you know? But is he not with Facino? Has he not yet arrived? Arrived? Why was he ever withdrawn? To be made physician to the Duke. A pretext, my friend, to deprive Facino of his healing services. Do you know that since his coming to Milan he has not been seen? There are rumors that he is dead, that the Duke has murdered him. Bellarion considered. Then he shrugged. Your imagination fools you, Venegono. If Gian Maria proposed to strike Facino, he would surely attempt something more active and effective. It may be little, I confess, but it is a straw that points the way of the wind. A straw, indeed, Bellarion agreed. But in any case, what do you require of me? You have not told me that. That you take a strong detachment of your men and repair at once to Milan to curb the Duke's evil intentions and to deal with Delatorre. For that my lord's orders would be necessary. My duty is here, Venegono, and I dare not neglect it, nor is the matter so urgent. It can wait until Bergamo has been reduced, which will not be long. Too long, it may be, but not all the passionate pleading with which he now distressed Bellarion could turn the latter from his clear duty, or communicate to him any of the vague alarms which agitated Venegono. And so, at last, he went his ways in despair, protesting that both Bellarion and Facino were beset with the blindness of those whom the gods wished to destroy. Bellarion, however, saw in Venegono's warning no more than an attempt to use him for the execution of a private vengeance. 3 days later, he thought he had confirmation of this. It came in a letter bearing Facino's signature, but penned in the crabbed and pointed hand of the Countess, who had been summoned from Melegnano to minister to her lord. It informed Bellarion that the physician Mombelli had come at last in response to Facino's request, and that Facino hoped soon to be afoot again. Indeed, there was already a perceptible improvement in his condition. So much for Venegono's rumors that Mombelli has been murdered, said Bellarion to himself, and laughed at the scaremongering of that credulous hothead. But he thought differently when after another 3 days a second letter reached him signed by the Countess herself. My lord begs you to come to him at once, she wrote. He is so ill that Messer Mombelli despairs of him. Do not lose a moment, or you may be too late. He was more deeply stirred by that summons than by anything he could remember. If those who accounted him hard and remorselessly calculating could have seen him in that moment, the tears filming his eyes at the very thought of losing this man whom he loved, they must have formed a gentler opinion of his nature. He sent at once for Carmignola and ordered a strong horse to be saddled and 20 lances to prepare to ride with him. However, they did not. They followed, for he rode like one possessed of devils. In 3 hours he covered the 40 miles of difficult road that lay between Bergamo and Pavia, leaving one horse foundered and arriving on a second one. That was spent by the time he reached Filippo Maria's stronghold. Down he flung from it in the great courtyard, and, staggering and bespattered, he mounted the main staircase so wide and of such shallow steps that it was possible to ascend on horseback. Without pausing to see the prince, he had himself conducted straight to Ficino's chamber, and there under the damask-hung canopy he found his adoptive father supine, inert, his countenance leaden-hued, looking as if he were laid out in death, save for his stertorous breathing and the fire that still glowed in the eyes under their tufted, fulvid brows. Bellarion went down on his knees beside the bed and took, in both his own that were so warm and strong, the cold, heavy hand that lay upon the coverlet. The gray head rolled a little on its pillow. The ghost of a smile irradiated the strong, rugged face. The fingers of the cold hand faintly pressed Bellarion's. "Good lad, you have lost no time," he said in a weak, rasping voice. "And there is no time to lose. I am sped. Indeed, my body's dead already. Mom Belly says the gout is mounting to my heart." Bellarion looked up. Beyond the bed stood the countess, fretful and troubled. At the foot was Mom Belly, and in the background a servant. "Is this so?" he asked the physician. "Can your skill avail nothing here?" "He is in God's hands," said Mom Belly, mumbling indistinctly. "Send them away," said Ficino, and his eyes indicated Mom Belly and the servant. "There is little time, and I have things to tell you. We must take order for what's to follow." The orders did not amount to very much. He required of Bellarion that he should afford the countess's protection, and he recommended to him also Filippo Maria. "When John Galeazzo died, he left his sons in my care. I go to meet him with clean hands. I have discharged my trust, and dying I hand it on to you. Remember always that John Maria is Duke of Milan, and whatever the shortcomings he may show, for your own sake if not for his, practice loyalty to him, as you would have your own captains be loyal to you." When at last, wearied and announcing his desire to rest, Ficino bade him go, Bellarion found Mom Belly pacing in the hall of mirrors, and sent him to Ficino. "I shall remain here within call," he said, and oblivious of his own fatigue, he paced in his turn that curious floor whereon birds and beasts were figured in mosaics under the gaudy flashing ceiling of colored glass, whence the place derived its name. There Mom Belly found him a half-hour later, when he emerged. "He sleeps now," he said. "The countess is with him." "It is not yet the end?" Bellarion asked. "Not yet. The end is when God wills. He may linger for some days." Bellarion looked sharply at the doctor, considered him. Indeed, now for the first time since his arrival, this Mom Belly was a man of little more than 35. He had been vigorous of frame, inclining a little to portliness, rubicund if grave of countenance, with strong white teeth and bright dark eyes. Bellarion beheld now an emaciated man upon whose shrunken frame a black velvet gown hung in loose folds. His face was pale, his eyes dull, but oddest of all, the very shape of his face had changed. His jaw had fallen in, so that nose and chin were brought closer like those of an old man, and when he spoke he hissed and mumbled indistinctly over toothless gums. "By the host, man, what has happened to you?" Mom Belly shrank visibly from the questions and from the stern eyes that seemed to search his very soul. I have been ill," he faltered, "very ill. It is a miracle I am alive today. But your teeth, man, I have lost them, as you see, a consequence of my disease." A horrible suspicion was sprouting in Bellarion's mind, nourished by the memory of the rumor of this man's death which Venegono had reported. He took the doctor by the sleeve of his velvet gown and drew him towards one of the double windows. His shrinking, his obvious reluctance to undergo this closer inspection, were so much added food to Bellarion's suspicion. "How do you call this disease?" he asked. Clearly, from his hesitancy, Mom Belly had been unprepared for question. It is a sort of podagric affection," he mumbled. "And your thumb? Why is that bandaged?" Terror leapt to Mombelli's eyes. His toothless jaws worked fearfully. That is not an injury. Take off the bandage. Take it off, man. I desire to see this injury. Do you hear me? At last, Mombelli, with shaking fingers, stripped the bandage from his left thumb and displayed it naked. Bellarion went white, and his eyes were dreadful. You have been tortured, Master Doctor. John Maria has subjected you to his Lent. This Lent of John Maria's invention was a torment lasting 40 days, on each of which one or more teeth were torn from the patient's jaws. Then day by day a fingernail, whereafter followed the eyes and finally the tongue, whereupon the sufferer being rendered dumb and unable to confess what was desired, he was shown at last the mercy of being put to death. Mombelli's livid lips moved frantically, but no words came. He reeled where he stood until he found the wall to steady him, and Bellarion watched him with those dreadful, searching eyes. To what end did he torture you? What did he desire of you? I have not said he tortured me. It is not true. You have not said it. No, but your condition says it. You have not said it, because you dare not. Why did he do this? And why did he desist? Bellarion gripped him by the shoulders. Answer me. To what did the torments undergone suffice to constrain you? Will you answer me? Oh, God! Groaned the physician, sagging limply against the wall and looking as if he would faint. But there was no pity in Bellarion's face. Come with me, he said. It was almost by main force that he dragged the wretched doctor across that hall out to the gallery and down the wide steps to the great court. Here, under the arcade, some men-at-arms of Facino's bodyguard were idling. Into their hands Bellarion delivered Mombelli. To the question chamber, he said shortly. Mombelli, shattered in nerve and sapped of manhood by his sufferings, cried out, piteously inarticulate. Pitilessly Bellarion waved him away, and the soldiers bore him off, screaming, to the stone chamber under the northeastern tower. There, in the middle of the uneven stone floor, stood the dread framework of the rack. Bellarion, who had followed, ordered them to strip him. The men were reluctant to do the office of executioners, but under the eyes of Bellarion, standing as implacable as a god of wrath, they set about it, nevertheless, and all the while the broken man's cries for mercy filled that vaulted place with an ever-mounting horror. At the last, half-naked, he broke from the men's hands and flung himself at Bellarion's feet. In the name of the sweet Christ, my lord, take pity on me. I can bear no more. Hang me if you will, but do not let me be tortured again. Bellarion looked down on the groveling, slobbering wretch with infinite compassion in his soul, but there was no sign of it on his countenance or in his voice. You have but to answer my question, sir, and you shall have your wish. You shall be hanged without further suffering. Why did the Duke torture you, and why did the torture cease when it did? To what importunities did you yield? Already you have guessed it, my lord. That is why you use me so. But it is not just, as God's my witness. It is not just. What am I but a poor man caught in the toils of the evil desires of others? As long as God gave me the strength to resist, I resisted, but I could bear no more. There was no price at which I would not have purchased respite from that horror. Death I could have borne had that been all they threatened. But I had reached the end of my endurance of pain. Oh, my lord, if I were a villain, there would have been no torture to endure. They offer me bribes great enough to dazzle a poor man, that would have left me rich for the remainder of my days. When I refused, they threatened me with death unless I did their infamous will. Those threats I defied. Then they subjected me to this protracted agony, which the Duke impiously calls his Lent. They drew my teeth, brutally with unutterable violence, 2 each day until all were gone. Broken and most starved as I was, distracted by pain, which for a fortnight had been unceasing, they began upon my fingernails. But when they tore the nail from my left thumb, I could bear no more. I yielded to their infamy. Bellarion made a sign to men, and they pulled Mombelli to his feet. But his eyes dared not meet the terrible glance of Bellarion. You yielded to their demands that, under pretense of curing him, you should poison my lord Facino. That is the thing to which you yielded. But when you say they, whom do you mean? The Duke John Maria and Antonio Delatorre. Bellarion remembered Venegono's warning. He is a thing of venom, like the emblem of his house. Poor wretch, said Bellarion. You deserve some mercy, and you shall have it, provided you can undo what you have done." "Alas, my lord," Mombelli groaned, wringing his hands in a passion of despair. "Alas, there is no antidote to that poison. It works slowly, gradually corroding the intestines. Hang me, my lord, and have done. Had I been less of a coward, I would have hanged myself before I did this thing." But the Duke threatened that if I failed and the torture should be resumed and continued until I died of sheer exhaustion. Also, he swore that my refusal would not save my Lord Facino, whom he would find other means of dispatching. Bellarion stood between loathing and compassion, but there was no thought in his mind of hanging this poor wretch who had been the victim of that malignant Duke. He uttered an order in cold, level tones: "Restore him his garments and place him in confinement until I send for him again." On that he departed from that underground chamber and slowly, thoughtfully made his way above. By the time he reached the courtyard, his resolve was taken, though his neck should pay for it. John Maria should not escape. For the first and only time in those adventurous years of his did, he swerved from the purpose by which he laid his course, and turned his hand to a task that was not more or less directly concerned with its ultimate fulfillment. And so, without pausing for rest or food, you behold him once more in the saddle, riding hard from Milan on that Monday afternoon. He conceived that he bore thither the first news of Facino's moribund condition, but rumor had been ahead of him by a day and a half, and the rumor ran, not that Facino was dying, but that he was already dead. In all the instances history affords a poetic justice, to give pause to those who offend against God and man, none is more arresting than that of the fate of John Maria Visconti. Already on the previous Friday word had reached the Duke, not only from Mombelli, but from at least one of the spies he had placed in his brother's household, that the work of poisoning was done and that Facino's hours were numbered. Gloating with dilatory and Lanate over the assurance that at last the ducal neck was delivered from that stern heel under which so long it had writhed like the serpent of evil under the heel of St. Michael, John Maria had been unable to keep the knowledge to himself. About the court on that same Friday night, he spoke unguardedly of Facino as dead or dying, and from the court the news filtered through the city and was known to all by the morning of Saturday. And that news carried with it a dismay more utter and overwhelming than any that had yet descended upon Milan since John Maria had worn the ducal crown. Facino, when wielding the authority of ducal governor, had been the people's bulwark against the extortions, brutalities, and criminal follies of their duke. When absent and deposed from power, he had still been their hope, and they had possessed their soul as best they could against the day of his return, which they knew must dawn. But Facino dead meant an unbridling of the Duke's bestiality, a free charter to his misrule, and for his people an outlook of utter hopelessness. It may be that they exaggerated in their own minds this calamity. It was for them the end of the world. Despair settled that morning upon the city. The Duke would have laughed if it had been reported to him, because he lacked the wit to perceive that when men are truly desperate, catastrophes ensue, and at once. Whilst the great mass of the people were stricken by horror into a dull inertia, there were those who saw that the situation called for action. Of these were members of the leading Ghibelline families of Baggio, of Del Meno, Trivozzi, Aliprandi, and others. There was Apertino Manegazza, captain of the ducal guard, whose face the Duke had one day broken with his iron gauntlet, and fiercest and most zealous of all there was that Giovanni Pustolo Venegono, whose family had suffered such deep and bitter wrongs at the Duke's hands. There was no suspicion in the mind of any that the Duke himself was responsible for the death of Facino. It was simply that Facino's death created a situation only to be met by the destruction of the Duke. And this situation the Duke himself had been at such hideous pains to bring about. And so, briefly to recapitulate here a page of Visconti history, it came to pass that on the Monday morning, which was the first day of the Litany of May, as John Maria, gaily clad in his colors of red and white, was issuing from his bedroom to repair to Mass in the church of St. Gothard, he found in the antechamber a score of gentlemen not latterly seen about his court. Manegazza, who had command of the entrance, was responsible for their presence. Before the Duke could comment upon this unusual attendance, perhaps before he had well observed it, 3 of them were upon him. "This from the Pustola," cried Venegono, and with his dagger clove the Duke's brow, slaying him instantly. Yet before he fell, Andrea Baggio's blade was buried in his right thigh, so that presently that white stocking leg was as red as its fellow. As a consequence, Bellarion reaching Milan at dusk, that evening found entrance denied him at the Ticinese gate, which was held by Paolo del Baggio with a strong following of men-at-arms. Not until he disclosed himself for Facino's lieutenant was he admitted and informed of what had taken place. The irony of the event provoked in him a terrible mirth. "Poor purblind fool," was his comment. He never guessed when he was torturing Mombelli that he was torturing him into signing his own death warrant. And the laugh with which he rode on into the city left Baggio wondering whether his wits had turned. He rode through streets in uproar, where almost every man he met was armed. Before the broken door of a half-shattered house hung some revolting bleeding rags. What once had been a man? These were all that remained of Squarcia Giramo, the infamous kennel master who had been torn into pieces that day by the mob, and finally hung there before his dwelling, which on the morrow was to be razed to the ground. He came to the old Broletto in the church of St. Gothard, and paused there to survey the Duke's body where it lay under an apronful of roses, which had been cast upon it by a harlot. Thence he repaired to the stables of the palace, and by making himself known procured a fresh horse. On this he made his way through the ever-increasing tumult of the streets, back to the Ticinese gate, and he was away through the darkness to cover for the second time that day the 20 miles that lie between Milan and Pavia. It was past midnight when, so jaded that he kept his feet by a sheer effort of the will, he staggered into Filippo Maria's bedchamber, ushered by the servant who had preceded him to rouse the prince. Filippo Maria sat up in bed, blinking in the candlelight, at that tall, swaying figure that was almost entirely clothed in mud. "Is that you, Lord Bellarion? You have heard that Facino is dead. God rest his soul." A harsh, croaking voice made him answer, "I, an avenged Lord Duke." A quiver crossed the pale fat face under its sleek black cap of hair. The coarse lips parted. Lord Duke," he said. The high-pitched voice was awe-stricken. "Your brother John Maria is dead, my lord, and you are Duke of Milan." "Duke of Milan? I am—" The grotesque young face showed bewilderment, confusion, fear. "And John Maria, dead, you say?" Bellarion did not mince matters. He was dispatched to hell this morning by some gentlemen in Milan. "Jesus Mary!" croaked the prince and fell to trembling. "Murdered? And you?" He heaved himself higher in the bed with one arm, whilst he flung out the other in accusation. He did not love his brother. He profited greatly by his death. But a Visconti does not permit that others shall lay hands on Visconti. Bellarion laughed oddly. He had been forestalled. Perhaps it was as well. No need now to speak of his intentions. He was slain on his way to Mass this morning, at just about the hour that I arrived here from Bergamo. The accusing arm fell heavily to the prince's obese flank. The beady, lackluster eyes still peered at the young condottiero. "Almost I thought, and Giannino is dead, murdered, God rest him." The phrase was mechanical. "Tell me about it." Bellarion recited what he knew, then staggered out, on the arm of the servant who was to conduct him to a room prepared for him. "What a world! What a dunghill!" he muttered as he went. "And how well the old abbot knows it. Pax multa in cella, foris autumn plurima bella." Chapter 6, The Inheritance. Facino Cane, Count of Biandrate, Lord of Navarra, Dertona, Varese, Rosate, Valsicina, and of all the lands on Lake Maggiore as far as Vogagna, was buried with great pomp in the church of San Pietro in Ciel d'Oro. His chief mourners were his captains summoned from Bergamo to do that last honor to their departed leader. At their head, as mourner-in-chief, walked Facino's adoptive son Bellarion Cane, Count of Gavi. The others included Francesco Buswan of Carmignola, Giorgio Valperga, Nicolino Marzaglia, Werner von Stoffel, and Vogiois the Burgundian. Königshofen and the Piedmontese Giason Trotta were absent, having remained at Bergamo with the army. Thereafter the captains assembled in the Hall of Mirrors to hear the will and last instructions of Facino. To read them came Facino's secretary, accompanied by the Pavese notary who had drawn up the testament 3 days ago. Thither also came the countess robed entirely in black and heavily veiled. The rich and important fief of Valsicina was now disclosed to have been left by Facino to his adoptive son Bellarion, in earnest of my love and to recompense his loyalty and worth. Apart from that and a legacy in money for Carmignola, the whole of his vast territorial possessions of cities, lands, and fortresses mostly acquired since he'd been deposed in favor of Malatesta, besides the enormous sum of 400,000 ducats, were all bequeathed to his widow. He expressed a wish that Bellarion should succeed in the command of his condata, and reminding his other captains that strength lies in unity, he recommended them to remain united under Bellarion's leadership, at least until the task of restoring order to the duchy should be fulfilled. To his captains also he recommended his widow, putting it upon them to see her firmly established in the dominions he bequeathed to her. When the reading was done, the captains rose in their places and turned to Madonna Beatrice, where she sat like an ebony statue at the table's head. Carmagnola, ever theatrical, ever a man of attitudes, drew his sword with a flourish and laid it on the board. Madonna, to you I surrender the authority I held under my lord Facino, and I leave it in your hands until such time as it shall please you to reinvest me in it. The ceremonious gesture caught the fancy of the others. Valperga followed the example instantly, and presently 5 swords lay naked on the oak. To these Bellarion, after a moment, a little scornful of his ritual, as he was of all unnecessary displays, added his own. The Countess rose. She thanked them in a voice that shook with emotion, and one by one restored their weapons to them, naming each as she did so. Bellarion's, however, she left upon the board, wherefore Bellarion, wondering a little, remained when she dismissed the others. Slowly then she resumed her seat. Slowly she raised and threw back her veil, disclosing a face, which beyond a deeper pallor resulting, perhaps, from contrast with her sable raiment, showed little trace of grief. Her feline eyes considered him, a little frown between their fine black brows. You were the last to offer me that homage, Bellarion. Her voice was slow and softly attuned. Why did you hesitate? Are you reluctant? It was a gesture, Madonna, that becomes the Carmagnolas of this world. Sincerity requires no symbols, and it was only at the symbol that I boggled. My service and my life are unreservedly at your command. There was a pause. Her eyes continued to ponder him. Take up your sword, she said at last. He moved to do so, and then checked. Yourself you restored theirs to the others. The others are not as you. Upon you has fallen the mantle of Facino. How much of that mantle will you wear, Bellarion? As much of it as my lord intended. You have heard his testament, Madonna, but not your own interpretation of it. Have I not said that my life and services are at your command, as my lord, to whom I owe everything, enjoined upon me? Your life and services, she said slowly. Her breast heaved as if in repressed agitation. That is much to offer. Bellarion, do you ask nothing in return? I offer these in return for all that I have received already. It is I who make payment, Madonna. Again there was a baffled pause. She sighed heavily. You make it hard for me, Bellarion. There was a pathetic break in her voice. What do I make hard? She rose, and in evident timidity came to stand before him. She set a white hand on the black velvet sleeve of his tunic. Her lovely face, which time had dealt so mercifully, was upturned to his, and there was now no arrogance in its lines or in her glance. She spoke quietly, wistfully. You may think, Bellarion, that with my lord scarce buried this is not the hour for what I have to say, and yet, by the very fact of my lord's death and by the very terms of his testament, this is the hour, because it must be the hour of decision. Here and now we must determine what is to follow. Tall and coldly stern he stood, looking down upon her who swayed a little there, so close to him that his nostrils were invaded by the subtle essences she used. I await your commands, Madonna. My commands? My commands? Dear God, what commands have I for you? She looked away for an instant, then brought her eyes back to his face and her other hand to his other sleeve, so that she held him completely captive now. A faint color stirred in the pale cheeks. My lord has left me great possessions. They might serve as a footstool to help you mount to a great destiny. A little smile hovered about his lips as he looked down upon her who waited so breathlessly, her breast now touching his own. You are offering me, he said, and stopped. Can you be in doubt of what I am offering? It is the hour of great decisions, Bellarion, for me and for you. Closer she pressed, so that her weight was against him. She was deathly pale again. Her eyes were veiled. In unity is strength. That was Facino's last reminder to us. And in what unity could there be greater strength than in ours? Facino's army, the strongest that ever followed him, is solidly behind us, so that we stand together. With that and my resources, you need set no bounds to your ambition. You may be Duke of Milan, if you will. You may even realize Galeazzo's dream and make yourself King of Italy. His hovering smile settled and deepened, but the dark eyes grew sad. The world and you have never suspected, he said gently, that I am not really ambitious. You have witnessed my rise in 4 short years from a poor nameless, starveling scholar to knighthood, lordships, wealth, and fame. And therefore, you imagine that I am one who has striven for the bounties of fortune. It is not so, Madonna. I have labored for ends that are nowise bound up with the hope of any of these rewards, which I hold cheap. They are hollow vanities, empty bubbles, gewgaws to delight the children of the world. Possessions come to me, titles, honors, which deceive me no more than I desired them. She drew away from him a little, and looked at him almost in awe. God, you talk like a monk. It is possible that I think like one, and very natural remembering how I was nurtured. There is one task, one purpose which is to tame me in this world of men. When that is accomplished, I think I shall go back to the cell where there is peace. You. Her hands had fallen from his arms. She gasped now in her amazement. With the world at your feet if you choose. To renounce all? To go back to the chill loneliness and joylessness of monkhood? Bellarion, you are mad. Or else saying, Madonna, who shall judge? And love, Bellarion? Is there no love in the world? Does that not lend reality to all these things that you deem shams? Does it heal the vanity of the world? He cried. It is a great power, as I perceive. For love men will go mad. They will become beasts. They will murder and betray. Heretic. That startled him a little. Once before he had been dubbed heretic for beliefs to which he clung with assurance, and experience had come to lay bare his heresy to his own eyes. Upon occasion, Madonna, we have talked of love, you and I, had I given heed, had your beauty beglamoured me. What a treacherous thing should I not have been in Facino's eyes. Do you wonder that I mistrust love as I mistrust all else the world can offer me? While Facino lived, that... She broke off. Her eyes were on the ground, her hands now folded in her lap. She had drawn away from him a little and leaned against the table's edge. Now! She parted her hands and held them out, leaving him to guess her mind. Now his behests are upon me, and they shall be obeyed as if he still lived. What is there in his behests against what I was offering? Am I not commended to you by his testament? Am I not a part of his legacy to you? The service of you is, and your loyal servant, Madonna, you shall ever find me. She turned aside with a little gesture of irritation and remained silent, thoughtful. A sleek secretary broke in upon them. The Count of Pavia commanded the Lord Bellarion's presence in the library. A courier had just arrived from Milan with grave news. Say to His Highness that I come. The secretary withdrew. You give me leave, Madonna? She stood leaning sideways against the heavy table, her face averted. You may go. Her voice rasped. But he waited yet a moment. The sword, Madonna? Will you not arm me with your own hands for your service? She turned her head to look at him again, and there was now a curl of disdain on her pale lips. I thought you looked askance on symbols. Was not that your profession? She paused, but, without waiting for his answer, added, Take up your sword, yourself, you that are so fully master of your own destinies. And on that she turned and went, trailing her funereal draperies over the gay mosaics of that patterned floor. He remained where she left him until she had passed out of that great hall, and the door had closed. Then, at last, he fetched a sigh and went to restore his blade to its scabbard. His thoughts were on Facino, hardly cold in the grave, on this widow who had so shamelessly wooed him, yet in terms which demanded as a condition the satisfaction of her inordinate ambition, and lastly on that obese young prince who waited for him. And in the mirror of his mind, he saw a reflection of a scene now some months old. He saw again the glance of those beady, lecherous eyes lambent about Facino's countess. Inspiration came to him of how best he might gratify her vast ambition, her greed of greatness. Her suggestion to him had been that he should make her Duchess of Milan, and Duchess of Milan he would make her yet. On that half-ironic thought, he came to the library where the prince waited. Filippo Maria was seated at a table near one of the windows. Spread before him were some parchments, writing materials, and a horn of unicorn that was almost a yard long, of solid ivory, one of the library's most treasured possessions. The prince was more than usually pallid, his glance unsteady, his manner nervous and agitated. Perfunctorily, he made the inquiries concerning the obsequies of Facino, which courtesy demanded. He reiterated excuses already made for his own absence from the ceremony, an absence really based on resentment of the yoke which Facino had imposed upon him. That done, he picked up a parchment from the table. "Here's news," he said, and his voice trembled. "Istor Viscani has been created Duke of Milan." He paused, and the little dark eyes blinked up at the tall Bellarian standing composed at his side. "You knew already?" "Not so, Highness. And you show no surprise?" "It is a bold step, and it may cost Messer Istor his head, but it was to be expected from what had gone before." The beady eyes returned to the parchment, which shook in the podgy fingers. Fra Berto Caccia, the Bishop of Piacenza, preached a sermon to the people lauding the murder of my brother, and promising in Istor's name a golden age for Milan, with immunity from taxation. Thereupon they laid at his bastard feet the keys of the city, the standard of the Republic, and the ducal scepter. He dropped the parchment, and sat back folding plump, white hands across his paunch. "This calls for action speedily. We can provide action enough to surfeit Messer Istor." "Ha!" The great flabby face grew almost kindly. The little eyes beamed upon the condottiero. "Serve me well in this, Bellarion, and you shall know gratitude." Bellarion's gesture seemed to wave the notion of reward aside. He came straight to facts. "We can withdraw 8,000 men from Bergamo. The place is at the point of surrender, and 4,000 will well suffice to tighten the last grip upon the Malatesta vitals. Perhaps the Lord Astor has not included that in his calculations. With 8,000 men, we can sweep him out of Milan at our pleasure." "And you'll give orders? You'll give orders at once? The army, they tell me, is now in your control. Facino's authority has descended to you, and has been accepted by your brother captains. And now this arch-dissembler went to work. Hardly so much, Highness. Facino's captains have sworn fealty, not to me, but to the Lady Beatrice. But you then?" The news dismayed him a little. "What place is yours?" "At your Highness's side, if your Highness commands me." Yes. But whom do you command? Where exactly do you stand now?" "At the head of the army in any enterprise into which the Countess sends her captains." "The Countess?" The prince shifted his bulk uneasily in his chair, slewing round so as to face the soldier more fully. What if the Countess should not?" He waved his fat hands helplessly. "It is not likely that the Countess should oppose your own wishes, Highness." "Not likely? But, Lord of Heaven, it's possible." He heaved himself up, nervous, agitated. "I must know. I'll send for her." He reached for a handbell on the table, but Bellarion's hand closed over his own before he could ring. "A moment, Lord Prince, before you send for the Lady Beatrice. Had you not best consider precisely what you will say to her? What is to say beyond discovering her disposition towards me? Can you entertain a doubt upon that, Lord Prince?" Bellarion was smiling. Their hands came away together from the bell and fell apart. "Her disposition towards your potency is, to my knowledge, of the very kindliest. Such indeed that, I'll be frank with you, I found it necessary once to remind her of her duty to her lord." "Ah." The fat pale face quivered into something akin to malevolence. The prince remembered a sudden coolness in the countess and her removal to Melegnano, and perceived in this meddler's confession the explanation of it. "By St. Ambrose, that was bold of you." "I am accounted bold," Bellarion reminded him, deeming it necessary. The shifty eyes fell away uncomfortably under his glance. "But if she is kindly disposed, then I know that she was Highness, and may be rendered so again, though perhaps less easily now than heretofore." "Less easily? Why so?" "As Facino's widow, she is in wealth and power the equal of many a prince in Italy. She has considerable dominions, torn by Facino from the great heritage left by the Duke my father. In that rare burst of indignation, his whole bulk quivered like a great jelly. They might be restored to the ducal crown by peaceful arts. Peaceful arts? What arts? Will you be playing? But the time for direct answers was not yet. And not only has the Countess lands, but the control of a vast fortune, some 400,000 ducats. You will need money, Highness, for the pay of this great army now under Bergamo, and your own treasury will hardly supply it. There's taxation, but your Highness knows the ills that wait on that for a prince newly come into his own. And not only the lands and money of which your Highness stands in need, but the men also does the Countess bring. You but repeat yourself. Bellarion looked at him and smiled. Never, do I believe, did a prince find a bride more richly dowered. A bride? The youth was startled, terrified almost. A bride? Would less content your Highness? Would you be satisfied to receive the assistance of the Countess's possessions, when you may make them your own and wield them at your pleasure? He stared, his jaw fallen. Then slowly he brought his lips together again and licked them thoughtfully, screwing up his mean eyes. You are proposing that I should take to wife Facino's widow, who is twice my age? He asked the question very slowly, as if pondering each word of it. Bellarion laughed, not proposing it. Highness, it is not for me to make such proposals. I do not even know what the lady will say. But if she is willing to become Duchess of Milan, she can provide the means to make you Duke. Filippo Maria sat down suddenly. The sweat broke from his pale brow. He mopped it with his hand, disturbing the black fringe that disfigured it. Then, lost in thought, he stroked the loose folds of his enormous chin, and gradually his eyes kindled. At long length, he put forth his hand again to the bell. This time Bellarion did not interfere. He perceived in the act a young princess surrender to the forces of greed and lust which Bellarion himself had loose against him. He took his leave and went out with a sad knowledge that greed and wantonness would make of the woman, too, a ready prey. His work was done. She should have the thing she coveted, and find in it her punishment. Chapter 7 Prince of Valsicina, as Bellarion had calculated and disposed. So things fell out, and Filippo Maria Visconti, in the 22nd year of his age, led to the altar the widowed Countess of Beindrich, who was 39. As a young girl, she had married, at the bidding of ambition, a man who was 20 years her senior. As a middle-aged woman now, and for the same reason, she married one who was almost as much her junior. She had not the foresight to perceive that the grievance on the score of disparity of years which she had nursed against Facino would be nursed against herself to her ultimate destruction by this sly, furtive, and cruel prince to whom now she gave herself and her vast possessions. That, however, is no part of the story I have set myself to tell. Istor Visconti defended in vain his usurped dominion against John Maria's legitimate successor. Filippo Maria, with Carmignola in command of some 7,000 men, laid siege to Milan, whilst Bellarion went north to make an end of the Bergamo resistance. Because in haste to have done, he granted Malatesta easy terms of surrender, permitting him to ride out of the city with the honors of war, lance on thigh. Thereafter, having restored order in Bergamo and left there a strong garrison under an officer trust, he marched with the main army to join Filippo Maria, who was conducting operations from the mills on Monte Laperio, 3 miles from Milan. Some 4 weeks already had he spent there, with little progress made. Istor had enrolled and constrained to the defense of the city almost every man of an age to bear arms. It was necessary to make an end, and Bellarion himself with a few followers entered the castle of Porta Giovia, which was being held against Istor by Vimercati, the Castellan, from its walls. Having attracted the people by trumpet blast, he published Filippo Maria's proclamation, wherein the prince solemnly undertook that if the city were at once surrendered to him, it should have nothing to fear, that there should be no pillage, executions, or other measures punitive of this resistance to the state's legitimate lord. The news flew in every direction, with the result that before nightfall all those whom Istor had constrained to follow him had fallen away, and he was left with only his mercenaries. With these, next morning, he hacked away out through the Comasina gate as the people were throwing open to the new duke the gates of the city on the other side. Filippo Maria entered with a comparatively small following, and in the wake of a train of bread carts, sent ahead to relieve the famine, which already was beginning to press upon the inhabitants. The acclamations of "Live the Duke," quieted his natural timidity as he rode through the streets to shut himself up in the castle of Porta Giovia, which remained ever afterwards his residence. Not for Filippo Maria the palace of the old Broletto or the gaiety of courts. His dark, scheming, yet pusillanimous nature craved the security of a stronghold, for assisting him to the ducal throne, and no doubt to ensure their continued support. He rewarded his captains generously, and none more generously than Bellarion, to whom he considered that he owed everything. Bellarion was not only confirmed in the lordship of Valsicina in feud, for himself and his heirs forever, but the Duke raised the fief into a principality. Bellarion remained the Duke's marshal-in-chief and military advisor, and it was by the dispositions which he made during that summer and autumn of 1412 that the lands of the duchy were finally cleared of the insurgent brigands who had renewed their depredations. Peace being restored at home, and industry being liberated at last from the trammels that had lain upon it since the death of John Galeazzo, prosperity flowed swiftly back to the state of Milan, and the people heaped blessings upon the shy, furtive ruler of whom they saw so little. It is possible that Filippo Maria would have been content to rest for the present upon what was done, to leave the frontiers of the duchy as he found them, and to dismiss the greater part of the costly candatas in his employ. But Bellarion at his elbow goaded him to further enterprise, and met his sluggish reluctance with a culminating argument that shamed him into action. Will you leave, in tranquil possession, the brigands who have encroached upon the glorious patrimony built up by your illustrious father? Will you dishonor his memory and be false to your name, Lord Duke? Thus, and similarly, Bellarion, with a heat that was purely histrionic, he cared no more for the integrity of John Galeazzo's patrimony than he cared for that of the kingdom of England. What he cared for was that the order to dispossess those tyrants would sound the knell of Theodore of Montferrat. Thus, at last, should he be enabled to complete the service to which 5 years ago he had dedicated himself, and to which unfalteringly, if obscurely and tortuously, he had held. Very patiently had he waited for this hour, when, yielding at last to his bold importunities, the Duke summoned a council of the officers of state and the chief condottieri to determine the order in which action should be taken. At once Bellarion urged that a beginning should be made by recovering Vercelli, than which few strongholds were of more importance to the safety of the duchy. It provoked a protest from Beccarla, who was the Duke's minister of state. An odd proposal this from you, Lord Bellarion, remembering that it was by your own action in concert with the Count of Biandrate that the Marquis Theodore was placed in possession of Vercelli. Bellarion crushed him with his logic. Not odd, sir, natural. Then I was on the other side. And if, being on the other side, I conceive it important that Theodore should hold Vercelli, now that I am opposed to him, I conceive it equally important that he should be driven from it. There was a pause. Filippo Maria, somnolent in his great chair, looked round the group. What is the military view? He asked. He had noticed that not one of the captains had voiced an opinion. He was answered now by the burly Königshofen. I have no views that are not Bellarion's. I have followed him long enough to know that he's a safe man to follow. Giason Entrada, uninvited, expressed the same sentiment. Filippo Maria turned to Carmignola, who sat silent and thoughtful. And you, sir, he asked. Carmignola reared his blond head, and Bellarion braced himself for battle. But to his amazement, for once, for the first time in their long association, Carmignola was on his side. I am of Bellarion's mind magnificent. We who were with my Lord Ficino when he made alliance with Theodore of Montferrat know Theodore for a crafty, daring man of boundless ambition. His occupation of Vercelli is a menace to the peace of the duchy. After that, the other captains, Valperga and Marsilio, who had been wavering, threw in their votes, so that the military opinion was solidly unanimous. Filippo Maria balanced the matter for a moment. You are not forgetting, sirs, that for Theodore's good behavior I have in my hands a precious hostage, in the person of his nephew, the Marquis John Giacomo, in whose name Theodore rules. You laugh, Bellarion. That hostage was procured to ensure not the good faith of Theodore, but the safety of the real Prince of Montferrat. Carmignola has told your magnificence that Theodore is crafty, daring, and ambitious. It is a part of his ambition to make himself absolute sovereign, where at present he is no more than regent. Let your magnificence judge if the thought of harm to the hostage you hold would be a deterrent to him. A while still they debated. Then Filippo Maria announced that he would take thought and make known his decision when it was reached. On that he dismissed them. As they went from the council chamber to the captains witnessed the phenomenon of a yet closer unity between Bellarion and Carmignola. The new prince of Valsicina linked arms with Francesco Buswan and drew him away. "You will do us service in this matter, Ser Francesco, if you send word to Lady Valeria and her brother urging them to come at once to Milan and petition the Duke to place John Giacomo upon his throne. He is of full age, and only his absence from Montferrat enables Theodore to continue in the regency." Carmignola looked at him suspiciously. "Why do you not send that message yourself?" Bellarion shrugged and spread his hands a little. "I have not the confidence of the princess. A message from me might be mistrusted." Carmignola's fine blue eyes pondered him still with that suspicious glance. "What game do you play?" he asked. "I see that you mistrust me, too. I ever have done." "It's a compliment," said Bellarion. "If it is, I don't perceive it. If you did, you wouldn't pay it. You are direct, Carmignola, and for that I honor you. I am not direct, and yet you may come to honor me for that, too, when you understand it. If you ever do, you ask what game I play. A game which began long ago, in which this is the last move. The alliance I brought about between Ficino and Theodore was a move in this game. The securing of the person of John Giacomo of Montferrat as a hostage was another, to make it possible for Theodore to occupy Vercelli and make himself Lord of Genoa, yet another. My only aim was to unbridle his greed so that he should become a menace to the duchy against such a day as this, when on the Duke's side it is my duty to advise his definite destruction." Carmignola's eyes were wide. Amazement overspread his florid, handsome face. "By the bones of St. Ambrose, you play mighty deep." Bellarion smiled. "I am frank with you. I explain myself. It is tedious, but necessary so as to conquer your mistrust and procure your cooperation. To make me a pawn in this game of yours, that is to describe yourself unflatteringly. Francesco Buswan of Carmignola is no man's pawn." "No, by God, I am glad you perceive that. Should I have explained myself if I did not?" said Bellarion to assure him of a fact of which clearly he was far from sure. "Tell me why you so schemed and plotted?" Bellarion sighed. "To amuse myself, perhaps. It interests me. Ficino said to me that I was a natural strategist. This broader strategy upon the great field of life gives scope to my inclinations. He was thoughtful, chin in hand. I do not think there is more in it than that." And abruptly he asked, "You'll send that message?" Carmignola, too, considered. There was a dream that he had dreamed, a game that he could play, making in his turn a pawn of this crafty brother captain, who sought to make a pawn of him. "I'll go to Melegnano in person," he announced. He went, and there dispelled the fretful suspense in which the Princess Valeria waited for a justice of which she almost despaired. He dealt in that directness, which was the only thing Bellarion found to honor in him, but the directness now was in his manner only. "Lady, I come to bid you take a hand in your own and your brother's reinstatement. Your petition to the Duke is all that is needed now to persuade him to the step which I have urged, to march against the usurper Theodore and cast him out." It took her breath away. "You have urged this, you, my lord? Let me send for my brother that he may thank you, that he may know that he has at least one stout, brave friend in the world. His friend and your servant, Madonna." He bore her white hand to his lips, and there were tears in her eyes as she looked upon his bowed, handsome head. "My hopes, my plans, my scheme for you are to bear fruit at last." "Your schemes for me?" Her brows were knit over her moist, dark eyes. He laughed, a jovial, debonair, and laughter-loving gentleman, this Francesco Buswan of Carmignola, so as to provide a cause disposing the Duke of Milan to proceed against the regent Theodore. "The hour has come, Madonna. It needs but your petition to Filippo Maria, and the army marches. So that I command it, I will see justice done to your brother." "So that you command it? Who else should?" Carmignola's bright face was overcast. "There is Bellarion Kane." "That knave!" She recoiled, her countenance troubled. "He is the regent's man. It was he who helped the regent to Vercelli and to the lordship of Genoa." "Which he never could have done," Carmignola assured her, "but that I abetted him. I saw that thus I should provide a reason for action against the regent when later I should come to be on the Duke's side." "Ah, that was shrewd. to feed his ambition until he overreached himself. Carmignola strutted a little. It was a deep game, but we are at the last move in it. If you mistrust this Bellarion, mistrust him. She laughed a bitter little laugh, and she poured forth the tale of how once he had been a spy sent by Theodore to embroil her, and how thereafter he had murdered her one true and devoted friend Count Spigno. Feeding her mistrust and bringing John Giacomo fully to share it, Carmignola conducted them to Milan and procured audience of them with the Duke. Filippo Maria received her in a small room in the very heart of the fortress, a room to which he had brought something of the atmosphere of his library at Pavia. Here were the choicely bound manuscripts, and the writing table with its sheaves of parchment, and its horn of unicorn, which as all the world knows is a prophylactic against all manner of ills of the flesh and the spirit. Its double window looked out upon the court of San Donato, where the October sunshine warmed the red brick to the color of the rose. He gave her a kindly welcome, then settled into the inscrutable inertia of an obese Eastern idol, while she made her prayer to him. When it was done, he nodded slowly and dispatched his secretary in quest of the Prince of Valsicina. The name conveyed nothing to her, for she had not heard of Bellarion's latest dignity. You shall have my decision later. Madonna, it is almost made already and in the direction you desire. When I have conferred with the Prince of Valsicina upon the means at our command, I will send for you again. Meanwhile, the Lord of Carmignola will conduct you and your brother to my Duchess, whom it will delight to care for you. He cleared his throat. You have leave to go, he added in his shrill voice. They bowed and were departing, when the returning secretary, opening the door and holding up the arras that masked it, announced, the Prince of Valsicina. He came in erect and proud of bearing, for all that he still limped a little. His tunic was of black velvet edged with dark brown fur. A heavy gold chain hung upon his breast. A girdle of beaten gold gripped his loins and carried his stout dagger. His hose were in white and blue stripes. From the threshold, he bowed low to the prince and then to Madonna Valeria, who was staring at him in sudden panic. She curtsied to him almost despite herself, and then made haste to depart with Carmignola and her brother. But there was a weight of lead in her breast. If action against Theodore depended upon this man's counsel, what hope remained? She put that question to Carmignola. He quieted her fears. After all, he is not omnipotent. Our fealty is not to him, but to the Duchess Beatrice. Win her to your side, and things will shape the course you desire, especially if I command the enterprise. And meanwhile, this man whom she mistrusted was closeted with the Duke, and the Duke was informing him of this new factor in their plans against Montferrat. She desires us to break a lance in her brother's behalf. But Montferrat is loyal to Theodore. They have no opinion there of John Giacomo, and to impose by force of arms a prince upon a people is perhaps to render that people hostile to ourselves. If that were so, and I confess that I do not share your potency's apprehensions, it would still be the course I should presume to advise. In Theodore you have a neighbor whom ambition makes dangerous. In John Giacomo you have a mild and gentle youth, whose thoughts, since his conversion from debauchery, turn rather to religion than to deeds of arms. Place him upon the throne of his fathers, and you have in such a man not only a friendly neighbor, but a grateful servant. Ha! You believe in gratitude, Bellarion? I must, since I practice it. There followed that night a council of the captains, and since they were still nominally regarded as in the service of Ficino's widow, the Duchess herself attended it, and since the fortunes of the legitimate ruler of Montferrat was one of the issues, the Marquis John Giacomo and his sister were also invited to be present. The Duke at the head of the long table, with the Duchess on his right and Bellarion on his left, made known the intention to declare war immediately upon the region of Montferrat upon two grounds: his occupation of Milanese stronghold and lands of Vercelli, and his usurpation of the regency beyond the Marquis John Giacomo's attainment of full age. Of his captains now, he desired an account of the means at their disposal, and afterwards a decision of those to be employed in the undertaking. Carmignola came prepared with a computation of the probable forces which Theodore could levy, and they were considerable, not less than 5,000 men. The necessary force to deal with him was next debated, having regard also to certain other enterprises to which Milan was elsewhere committed. At length this was fixed by Bellarion. It was to consist of the Germans under Königshofen, Stoffel Swiss, Giasone Trotta's Italian mercenaries, and Marsilio's condata, amounting in all to some 7,000 men, that would leave free for other eventualities the condatas of Valperga and of Carmagnola, with whom were Ercole Belluno and Ugolino de Tenda. Against this, and on the plea that the Duke might require the services of the Prince of Valsicina at home, Carmagnola begged that the enterprise against Montferrat should be confided to his leadership, his own condata taking the place of Bellarion's, but all else remaining as Bellarion disposed. The Duke, showing in his pale face no sign of his surprise at this request, looked from Carmagnola to Bellarion, appearing to ponder, what time the Princess Valeria held her breath. At length the Duke spoke. "Have you anything to say to that, Valsicina?" "Nothing, if your Highness is content. You will remember that Theodore of Montferrat is one of the most skillful captains of the day, and if this business is not to drag on unduly, indeed if it is to be brought to a successful issue, you would do well to send against him of your best." A sly smile broke upon that sinisterly placid countenance. "By which you mean yourself." "For my part," said Königshofen, "I do not willingly march under another." "And for mine," said Stoffel, "whilst Bellarion lives, I do not march under another at all." The Duke looked at Carmagnola. "You hear, sir?" Carmagnola flushed uncomfortably. "I had set my heart upon the enterprise, Lord Duke." The Princess Valeria interposed. "By your leave, Highness, does my vote count for anything in this matter?" "Assuredly, Madonna, your own and your brother's." "Then, Lord Duke, my vote, indeed my prayer, is that my Lord of Carmagnola be given the command." The Duchess raised her long eyes to look at her in wonder. Bellarion sat inscrutable. The request wounded without surprising him. He knew her unconquerable mistrust of him. He had hoped in the end, which was now approaching to prove to her its cruel injustice. But if occasion for that were denied him, it would be no great matter. What signified was that her own aim should be accomplished, and, after all, they were not beyond the strength and skill of Carmagnola, who had his talents as a leader when all was said. The Duke's lackluster eyes were steadily upon Valeria. He spoke after a pause. "Almost you imply a doubt of the Prince of Valsicina's capacity." "Not of his capacity." "Oh, not of that." "Of what, then?" The question troubled her. She looked at her brother, and her brother answered for her. "My sister remembers that the Prince of Valsicina was once the Marquis Theodore's friend." "Was he so? When was that?" The Duke looked at Bellarion, but it was John Giacomo who answered the question. "When, in alliance with him, he placed him in possession of Vercelli and Genoa." "The alliance was the Lord Ficino's, not Valsicina's. Bellarion served under him, but so also did Carmagnola. Where is the difference between them?" "My Lord of Carmagnola acted then with a view to my brother's ultimate service," the princess answered. "If he was a party to the Marquis Theodore's occupation of Vercelli, it was only so that in that act the Marquis might provide a cause for the action that is now proposed against him by the Duke of Milan." Bellarion laughed softly at the light he suddenly perceived. "Do you mock that statement, sir?" Carmagnola challenged him. "Do you dare to say what was in my mind at the time? I have honored you for directness, Carmagnola, but it seems you could be subtle too." "Subtle?" Carmagnola flushed indignantly. "In what have I been subtle?" "In the spirit in which you favored Theodore's occupation of Vercelli," said Bellarion, and so left him gaping foolishly. "What else did you think I had in mind?" He smiled almost ingenuously into the other's face. The Duke rapped the table. Sirs, we wander, and there is this matter to resolve." Bellarion answered him. "Here, then, is a solution your Highness may be disposed to adopt. Instead of Valperga and his troops, I take with me Carmagnola and his own condata, which is of a similar strength, and, like Valperga's, mainly horse. Thus we march together and share the enterprise. But unless Bellarion commands it, Lord Duke, your Highness will graciously consider sending another condata in the place of mine," said Königshofen, and Stoffel was about to add his own voice to that, when the Duke, losing patience, broke in. Peace! I am Duke of Milan, and I give orders here. You are summoned to advise, not to browbeat me and say what you will and will not do. Let it be done as Valsicina says, since Carmagnola has set his heart upon being in the campaign. But Valsicina leads the enterprise. The matter is closed on that. You have leave to go.